Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. We still have a number of people streaming in, so we're going to give it just 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we will get started. Okay, good evening, everybody. We are going to get started. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at the WaterWise Community Center. Welcome to Landscape Transformation Basics. Before we get started, just a couple of notes. You can download the slides from this presentation at the URL currently on the screen, cbwcd.org/presentations. So if you're taking notes or wanting to refer back to any of the information on the slides later and aren't able to write it all down as we go, you can download that easily. If you go there and click on it, depending on your browser, it might download automatically, or it might load the whole presentation to your browser, and then you can, in the file window, save it. If that happens, it's a pretty large file, so you might need to give it a couple of minutes to load. And then you can also watch a previously recorded version of this workshop when we taught it last month on our YouTube channel. And you will get there at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And there we also have many other online recorded videos from past classes. Most of those are more deeper dives into some of the specifics of some of the things we'll only be able to talk about generally this evening. So you'll hear me refer to the YouTube videos at a number of times where we might only have time to introduce something, but if you really want to learn how to do it yourself, we have a longer format online workshop about that. So with that, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the organization that I am from and what we do. We are the WaterWise Community Center. Our formal name is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. We're a special district, so a local government organization, similar to a school district or a fire district, but we're much smaller. And we have a service area covering kind of the western edge of San Bernardino County. And we've been around since 1949, when the area was mostly agriculture, starting to urbanize, and most of the water use was to support agriculture. And people realized even back then that wise management of water was just key to life in this region. And so we were formed in a public vote in 1949, and our bread and butter is putting water into the ground, because our local groundwater basin, the Chino Basin, after which we're named, provides about 60% of our local water supply. It's a huge resource. And so throughout our service area, we have a number of basically large pits in the ground, like what you see on the right. If you're from our area, you'll see some of those along the 10 freeway, north and south, near the Monte Vista exit. Those are two of our properties. And those are, most of them are literally old gravel pits, which have since been re-engineered and are maintained to capture stormwater and also infiltrate some of them recycled water and imported water when there's good water years and it's readily available from Northern California. That water is cleaned through natural processes, and that helps recharge our groundwater table for use later. We don't supply water to anybody directly, but we work very closely with local water retailers as well as other agencies who are involved in maintaining our joint local water supply. But in addition to working on that supply side of water conservation, we also realize that it doesn't do that much good to save water if most of the water being used locally is not being used wisely. In residential areas, which is most of our local area, the typical single family home can use 60% or so of their water watering their landscape, which is usually lawn that is not used. And so we're not here to tell everyone they need to tear up their lawns, but we are here to demonstrate what people can do if they decide they want to trade that in for something that takes a lot less resources, that will be cheaper on the water bills over time, and provides many, many additional benefits beyond what the lawn probably ever did. So we have about a 3-acre demonstration garden, currently closed due to COVID, but normally open to the public 6 days a week for free. And we also do lots of education for all different kinds of groups, all different kinds of ages, from K through 12 curriculum integrated programs focused on watersheds and watershed health, through working with college groups, to doing a lot of education for community members, free workshops like this, as well as some more one-on-one programs for those in our local service area. And we do professional training for the landscape industry as well. To keep up with us and all of our free programs, our coming up workshops, the easiest way to do that is to sign up for our newsletter. You just get 1 email a month, and you can easily do that at cbwcd.org/newsletter. I really encourage you to sign up if you don't already get our newsletter. And with that, I'm going to come around to the poll in just a little bit. I still see that some more people are coming in. So I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you about this. Like I mentioned, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at the WaterWise Community Center. And I'm really kind of a nerd about landscapes. I've focused most of my professional career on landscapes in Southern California. And in that process, have done horticulture management, construction management. I have a master's degree in landscape architecture, and I've done landscape design. Before coming to the WaterWise Community Center, I worked in the public garden world. But I am really interested in a couple of things. I've been really pursuing for about the last 15 years, understanding how what we decide to do in our local landscapes, and a lot of that being just typical single family homes, sometimes community spaces, but just front yards and backyards, how what we do can change the way we live in the city, and how it can benefit our lifestyles while helping with environmental issues. And so at the WaterWise Community Center, I get to pursue that work. And one of my favorite parts about that is teaching classes to groups like yourself. So that's a little bit about me and what I do. And right before we do the opening poll, where you'll tell me a little bit about yourself, just a couple of housekeeping issues. So to connect with me and ask questions during this workshop, I ask you to please type your questions into the Q&A function. If you're new to Zoom, on your little Zoom panel where you have some different buttons, there'll be one that says Q&A, and you can click on that. It opens a little window, and you can type that in, and just type those in at any point in time. And I keep an eye on those, and then periodically I'll stop and I'll answer any questions. And I'll answer questions primarily that are topical to what we've just been talking about. Sometimes people have questions that are more about their personal situation and what might work for them. We'll have plenty of time at the end. I could stay past 8:30 to answer other questions. So you can feel free to ask those. I might have to hold some of those towards the end. And what we find with the number of people that we have in these workshops is that we normally don't unmute people to ask questions out loud. That tends to just take too long. So please type your questions into the Q&A. And then if you have comments or suggestions or anything along the way, please type those into the chat. That's the other button that you can open up. And I'll keep an eye on those as well and share some of that as we go. And if you have just any other comments or anything's unclear, please type that into the chat as we go, and I will try to make sure to clear things up. So with that, we're going to do just a couple of polls, one right now and one at the end. And so I am launching the first poll. You'll see that come up. And please just read the questions and click the answers. It'll only take just a couple of minutes. And that really tells me a lot about who you are, gets us some great numbers for tracking our programs, and really helps us understand who's in the audience. From Pamela, who just typed in the Q&A about being approved for a grant last year. Can you still use it? I'm not sure. It depends on what you're referring to. If you're referring to the turf replacement rebate from SoCalWatersmart.com, that is a 6-month process. So you probably can't, but you should be able to start over again and reapply is what I would say probably your best chance is going to be. The funding is still there if it was the turf removal or turf replacement rebate through SoCalWatersmart.com. So the answers are starting to come in. Thank you very much for everyone who has put them in. We'll give it just a couple of more minutes and then we'll get started with the content. About halfway done. Thank you. Thank you for everybody who are joining us from farther away, letting us know where you're from. We have San Diego, Chula Vista, some Pacific Northwest. So some of the stuff we'll talk about is more Mediterranean climate focused, Krista, but some of it is kind of universal. And from what I hear, things are headed more towards being a Mediterranean climate in some of the Pacific Northwest microclimates. So maybe some more stuff will apply to you. All over the place. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'll assume most of you found out about us on Eventbrite. So for those of you from other areas outside of California, we have Nevada, Colorado, hello. So general techniques we're going to talk about, all the design stuff will apply, but you're definitely going to want to, we're not going to talk a lot about specific plants, but you'll want to combine this information with the plants that are going to grow really well in your local area, maybe by connecting to your local master gardeners, or if there's a botanical garden with native plants in your area. I know for those of you in Nevada, Las Vegas, there's Las Vegas Springs Preserve. So combine what we talk about tonight with local resources. Okay, we're gonna stop the poll and we'll share the results. If you didn't get a chance to answer, not a problem at all. So the first one is just so we get our numbers. Most of you, it's the first time joining us. Welcome. I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel, our other online resources. Please sign up for our newsletter and join us in the future. Thank you for letting us know where you're from. A lot of people from other areas. So please, if you are from other areas, let us know in the chat where you're from. All the way from Melbourne, Australia. Welcome. How you found out about the workshop event, right? Most of you. Okay, cool. Thank you. And then this is where it gets really interesting to me. What's the current state of the yard you're thinking about renovating? So a few people, various states of lawn, various states of disrepair, which is common. Patch of weeds and bare dirt, very common as well. And so some of the aspects that we talked about tonight will definitely, in terms of lawn removal, also work really well for weed abatement. So we'll talk about that. And for those of you who are mostly interested in the topic, but don't have a particular yard you're thinking about, you're very welcome as well. And then what have the barriers been? Time, money, or project cost? Definitely. We'll talk about rebates for those of you in Southern California. Design, we'll talk quite a bit about design. We also have two each 3-hour long classes on our YouTube channel specifically about design. One is a general one called Do It Yourself Garden Design, and then the other one is focused on design with California native plants. And if you're still focused on California natives, both the workshops cover different stuff and they might be both useful to you. Taking out the lawn, we'll talk about that some. For those of you interested in site preparation, this Saturday, I'm going to be teaching a workshop. It will be from 9 to noon Pacific time on installation and establishment for water-wise and California native gardens. So for those of you who are interested in after the design, what do you do? That will be useful to you, either joining us live or watching the YouTube video afterwards. We're not going to talk much about irrigation because the last class that we taught was specifically about irrigation for water-wise gardens, and that is available right now. And a bunch of other things. So that knowing how to plant, we'll cover all of that this Saturday. A little bit about taking care of the garden as well, because we're going to be covering that first year. The first year in a garden is the most important for getting a garden off to a good start, getting those plants roots out and well established. And we'll be covering that this Saturday as well, in depth. And so thank you very much for sharing that with us. And with that, we are going to really get into it, starting with a basic premise. For those of you in Southern California, landscapes actually take up a lot of space in Southern California. Most of Southern California, and I think most of the areas where people have commented in as well, even if it's an urban area, we might have too many parking lots, we might have too much concrete and asphalt surface, but if you look at an aerial photograph of most of Southern California, it's very different than New York City, very different than downtown Los Angeles. There's actually a lot of green or brown in a lot of the neighborhoods. And if we look at our suburban areas, especially, for a long time, especially when we look at front yards, the question has just been, does it fit in with the neighborhood? Or if someone was going to go beyond that or get a little creative with their planting, it was only focused on what does it look like in most cases. And what our yards look like is very important. I think we all should have beautiful yards if we can. I know I want my front yard to be beautiful, but I really feel like the last series of droughts has opened up an opportunity for a new main question, which is not just what does it look like, but what does your yard do for you? You're investing resources in it in some way, whether that's maintenance, whether that's paying someone to maintain it, whether that's water. Most people, even if they cut off the water to their lawn, still end up having to just do weed abatement with their time or hire someone to do it. So what does your landscape do for you? What are you putting into it? And what are you getting back out of it? And it's my basic premise that these landscapes can do more for us by moving away from unused lawns that take a lot of resources. Not only are we going to use less resources, but we'll get a lot more out of it. So this is a picture of my front yard in the spring. And this is a picture of a part of that yard. That yard is young. So it's about 1.5 years old. It'll be 2 years in the spring and still growing in. But this is right outside the window that I'm sitting at right now. This is something that I took from sitting at the desk where I'm at now, where we have a California native front yard landscape. And this is just a branch sticking up out of the ground, tree trimming that we put in. And so in addition to having beautiful native plants, our yard is a haven for birds and pollinators. And so we put that there for birds to perch. And so we have birds coming all of the time. And this is a black phoebe, one of our local native birds. And you can see he has a little insect that he caught in his mouth. And this is just common seen. A couple minutes ago, I had a hummingbird coming right by the window to get some of the nectar off of a plant in bloom before it goes dark. So what does your landscape do? Those are a few things that I chose to have my landscape do. And it just is the fact that compared to the conventional landscapes that they would be replacing, California native and water-wise landscapes do more. And I would say that they should become the new conventional landscape because they require less resources. and they do so much more for us. They are beautiful. So these are some of my favorite California native plants. Most of these require water only about once a month, depending on your soil, maybe once every 3 weeks, once they've become established. So that's usually after the first year or so in the ground. Absolutely beautiful. Here's a combination of native plants with some succulents and other Mediterranean plants. So beauty is pretty easy to achieve, actually, and it's a much more dynamic and interesting beauty than just the typical flat lawn. Even if your lawn is perfect, you can just achieve so much more. And depending on how you set things up, they can also support habitat. Working with these plants, you will bring in things like butterflies, songbirds. You might have hummingbirds nesting in your yard or something nesting in your yard. And in a lot of our local areas, wild habitat is still being lost. And we can help provide refuges for especially birds, lizards, pollinators, butterflies that will live in urban areas. Our yards can help provide connectivity between larger wild spaces. Every year in my front yard, we have there's a migration of butterflies from the desert west of sister butterflies, and we have so many that just stop in our yard because we have so many plants for them, and they need that sustenance on their journey. And it's a lot of city stretch, a whole big stretch of city that they have to go through as they travel through urban Southern California. So it truly is, if you build it, they will come, and in most areas it will be habitat in action very quickly. And all this together makes our yards more enjoyable places to live and learn, and it really extends our feeling of our home. And whether that's for you or whether that's for your children or your grandchildren who might visit, trading in a yard that's a typical lawn where your ideal is to keep things static, just looking like green all year round and doing a lot of work for it, for a yard where you're embracing the seasonal changes. There's change throughout the year, and you can enjoy that instead of trying to keep a yard that wants to be brown green in the summer, which is what trying to keep a lawn alive is in Southern California. And it makes the whole thing so much more interesting and so much more enjoyable. I really like this quote from Lady Bird Johnson, who was one of the first nationwide proponents of working with native plants in our landscapes. She said that native plants give us a sense of where we are in this great land of ours. I want Texas to look like Texas and Vermont to look like Vermont. And I'm a little bit more cynical, but my take on it is similar. It costs a lot to live in Southern California. And if I'm lucky enough to have a piece of land where I can decide what's going to go there in the landscape, why would I want that to look like a parched imitation of an East Coast or maybe Western European landscape style? I want to wake up to the natural beauty of California every day and enjoy it every evening. And you can, and I do. So here's a picture of a relatively small California native front yard, kind of very naturalistic, that I really like. It's on a garden tour, and it's in Pasadena. And this was a pretty small front lawn on a side street, but pretty close to a pretty busy main street. And not only does this landscape provide beauty, provide habitat, almost have a sense of being out in the wild without being too overgrown, but it also makes the house feel a lot more set back from that busy street and just totally changes the feel of the whole property, not just the yard itself. You can get so much benefit out of it. So color, no problem. And even if you prefer a more traditional landscape style, here's an example. You can have that too, of a mostly California native, a few Mediterranean water-wise plants in a much more traditional style. It does take a lot more clipping. There's a professional yard service that takes care of it. It's higher maintenance to do this, and the habitat value is not quite as high. But if this is what appeals to you, if the other kind of look is a little bit too wild, this certainly uses a fraction of the water that the conventional landscape it replaced uses, and provides a lot more environmental benefit. But where do we start? One of the big ideas from the class is we don't start here. Even if you have a really good local nursery, you don't start at the nursery, because if you start at the nursery, what happens is you get one of this and one of that and two of this and two of that, and this thing looks nice in a 1-gallon pot and it has a nice little flower, so you get it, but you don't realize until you get home that it's going to be 12 feet wide. And if the label says it'll be 12 feet wide, usually it will, sometimes only in a couple of years. And then you might notice that some actually want more water, some actually want less water, or the labels might not say, and you might never look it up, or you might end up having to just kind of cram things together, which have different horticultural needs. Usually for most people, even pretty good gardeners, when they just hit the nursery and get excited about plants, things don't turn out so well. Now, if you have a local specialty nursery, then the staff can be very knowledgeable. And if you're looking for specific plant recommendations, sometimes showing them a picture on your cell phone can really get good results. But if you're thinking about especially a large project, you really want to go in with a plan. And so where you start is not with plants at all in most cases for the most successful project. Where you start is with your goals. Think about your goals for the project. And this whole design process is really a very straightforward process of coming up with a plan to meet all your goals. So this is the list of goals from the clients of mine who were probably the toughest clients I ever had, because they were my parents. They were never that interested in this sort of stuff. But then when the first round of Southern California turf replacement rebates came around, Department of Water and Power in Los Angeles was offering really good rebates. And so they decided that they were ready to give it a shot. They didn't use their lawn at all. And I'd convinced them that there were additional benefits. And so my father's goals were actually pretty easy. It was whatever makes your mom happy. So that was not going to be too bad. But my mom wanted to take a small yard and cram a whole bunch of goals into it. And I use a lot of pictures from those kind of personal or family projects, because I really am there for every single step of the way, and I get to take a lot of pictures and kind of tell the story. So here were my mom's list of goals: a comfortable place to sit and read, a place that feels relaxing, the sound of water to dampen sort of the noise from the neighborhood, something that would be relatively simple to maintain, something that would hide a less than attractive cinder block wall that goes all the way around the yard, something that would attract birds, something that would look nice, a space to grow some vegetables, and to cram that all into a pretty small backyard while somehow magically making it feel bigger at the same time. And we can do that all through the process of design, but we're not going to be successful. We're not going to be able to accomplish all of those things if we start by hitting the nursery and grabbing what looks good. And we have resources to help you with the plant selection part for those of you, especially in Southern California, but also a lot of plants that are going to be relevant to those of you in other dry or semi-arid areas. We'll get to that later. So here's just a quick example. Here is the backyard, the cinder block wall, not huge. Here's April 2015. This is plant layout day, and we had a meadow effect going. So this is actually a pretty high planting density. Yours might have fewer plants depending on the size of your plants. We're working with a lot of small plants here. And you can see just kind of keeping things pretty simple. We wanted the water feature in the center and a path around it. And so just working with wood stakes from the hardware store, so a piece of strap I had in the garage, and then just a bag of old flour. And so we'd kind of pull the strap and then sprinkle the flour, some measuring tapes. And this is your chance to look at it all. And even if you have a drawn out plan, kind of question things, walk through, does it feel comfortable, rearrange things. This is it right after planting. Water feature hasn't gone in yet. And it's normally at this stage that somebody who's doing this for the first time thinks, I should have gotten 3 times as many plants. There's no way that this is going to grow in. Resist the temptation. If you've done your research, if you've researched your plant sizes, it will come, things will start going. So this is April 2015 when it went in. This is October of that exact same year. So if we had gotten way more plants, we would have been way overplanted, had to remove a lot, had a lot more maintenance and work. So you want to do all the steps right, do your research on how to establish your garden well, get things growing healthily, good irrigation plan, and then let it go. And oftentimes in less than a year, you will be amazed at how much things grow in. And so what we did is we went with a water-wise kind of Mediterranean semi-dry meadow, just choosing one main grass-like plant called Berkeley sedge as kind of the main, what's sometimes called a matrix in landscape design, for holding things together, repeated a lot. And then we have some other accent grasses, flowers, here's bearded irises, and the water feature. And so by having that plan, we purchased way more of this one plant than we ever would have just randomly going to the nursery, and use that to kind of tie together this small space so we have a coherent landscape design. So here's the place to sit and read, the sound of water, some large bushes that were training up to small trees. We planted a vine on the back wall. Here's sitting at the bench looking towards the house. So it's pretty close, but we use the water feature and that presence to kind of section the space apart. Here's from the one raised bed that we had room for, kind of on the other side of the yard, looking towards the old lemon tree, which was one of the 2 plants that were able to remain. And then some seasonal pops of color from Mediterranean climate, water-wise, kangaroo paws from Australia, red hot poker from South Africa. And truly is, if you build it, they will come. So here's a falcon stopping by to take a drink in urban San Fernando Valley, Southern California. You can see some of the pops of spring color. And so that's kind of a very abbreviated version, and we're going to pull out a lot more of the steps right now. First, we'll start with a little bit of inspiration. Again, it can be anything that you want it to look like. So here is an all California native garden, very modern. So again, using Berkeley sedge, kept trim a little smaller, and then a larger blue colored grass, the wild rye, and then some native trees and shrubs. Thinking about patio spaces, this is actually at the California Botanic Garden, but a residential scale. And kind of looser patios with permeable surfaces, so the water doesn't wash off like concrete but can soak into the ground, work really well with water-wise gardens. It also often will improve the drainage in the yard. So gravel patio spaces that can just kind of blend into a gravel mulch underneath the plants like this. Here, surrounded by a combination of succulents, California native plants. The sages here will make this patio space smell incredible. Here's some pavers in the front yard with gravel in between, and you see a lot of front yard social spaces start to pop up as well, surrounded by water-wise and native plants. It could be a little bit more traditional or formal looking, could be very modern with hardscape holding together the bones with some shrubs and then having very loose kind of smaller plantings, or very naturalistic. To me, this is beautiful. The decomposed granite path lined with local river rock, and then kind of a California native meadow effect. And for those of you in Southern California, there are rebates available if you are removing a lawn, especially to help make it happen. And that could be, your lawn could be pretty brown looking as long as that thatch is still there. It doesn't need to be a beautiful green thing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the rebates that are available. For those of you who are not in our local area, might check with your local water provider, find out if there are incentives or rebates available, and just hang tight, and we will be getting back to much more about the process in just a minute if this doesn't apply to you. So the current rebates, if you are in Southern California, your main portal for rebates is all going to be in the same place through SoCalWatersmart.com. There is a turf replacement rebate. The dollar amount per square foot depends on your water provider. There are rebates for installing irrigation controllers, which automatically will adjust based on the weather. And those are going to be $80 per controller for less than 1 acre landscape. If you have a really large property, there's some additional incentives. And then we'll talk later about changing out your irrigation system. And one of the options for that is to install high efficiency rotating sprinkler nozzles. If you're going to be doing a whole yard and purchasing 30 nozzles or more, you can also get a rebate of $2 a nozzle, which won't cover the whole cost, but it will be something that helps. And for those of you in our very local area that the WaterWise Community Center serves, through the Inland Empire Utility Agency and your local water provider, which is Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley, Fontana, and Upland's not on here, but this includes Upland as well. You can get installed a free weather-based irrigation controller with taking an online class. And it's a great program installed for free by a professional landscape contractor, really top-notch controller. And if the controller location, which is normally your garage, is within distance of your home Wi-Fi system, or if you can extend it, you can get one where you can do everything either from your phone or your computer. It's so much easier to program than a traditional style irrigation controller, and will automatically update based on the weather if it's installed correctly. So you should definitely look into that. So for the turf replacement program, that will give you a rebate after you complete your project. So you upfront the cost, and after you provide proof of completing your project, and it starts with getting approved for your project, you will get a rebate per square foot up to 5,000 square feet. The minimum is $2 a square foot in the local area that we're coming from. That's the minimum. So that includes Pomona and Claremont. A lot of our local area is $3 a square foot. And then Monte Vista Water District is the highest. They're cooking in some extra at $3.50 a square foot. Just a couple of questions that have come in. Take a minute to answer them. Will the presentation deck for the presentation be available via email? It's not going to be via email for those of you who missed the beginning, but you can download it. So I'm typing into the chat right now at cbwcd.org/presentations. You can download the slides. It has all of our recent workshops, so the landscape transformation basic slides. And then there is a recording as well on our YouTube channel, which you can get to at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And we do that with all of our classes as well for any future classes you might be interested in. And then someone also asked, what time is the class this Saturday? That's at 9 a.m. Pacific. And you can find out about all of our classes if you go to cbwcd.org/waterwise workshops. I just put into the chat as well. That will be a quick link to our Eventbrite page where you can see all of our upcoming workshops and where you can register for them as well. So getting back to the rebate process, super important thing for the turf replacement rebate is you cannot begin any work on your project until after you've received approval for your rebate. So there's an application process, takes 2 to 3 weeks to get your approval, or if you did something wrong, they might deny it, but they'll let you know what you need to do to fix it. So to do that, you go to SoCalWaterSmart.com, go to the rebates header and select available rebates and the turf replacement program. And there you can get all of the details. Included some quick tips for where I've seen people kind of get caught up on the rebate process before. You need to know your total lot size. Sometimes people don't have that handy. So not just the size of the lawn, but the total lot size of the whole lot. If you don't have that handy, you can just type in your address to any search engine. And what will come up are a bunch of real estate websites with just profiles of every property, even if it hasn't been for sale for a long time. And somewhere on there, depending on the real estate company, you'll find the lot size for residential lots, usually in square feet. So you can get it right there. You will already have had to have decided which areas of your turf will be transformed. And so again, this is a turf replacement rebate. So if it's all weeds or all dirt, you won't be able to access it. It's to replace turf with the WaterWise garden, but the turf can be quite brown as long as it's there. You don't need to water a bunch to green it up to get approved. You'll have to have already decided which areas of your turf will be transformed, and that's the number of square feet each for the front, side, and or backyard. The rebate will pay per square foot up to 5,000 square feet. Depending on many factors, the rebate may or may not cover the entire cost of the project. I've worked with some people who have actually been able to get landscape contractors to cover the whole cost of the project based on the rebate amount. And those are pretty simple front yard, easy access projects. Not the most common thing, but it will significantly help if it is a turf removal, plants planted at reasonably small sizes, which is always the better way to go, is to plant things pretty small. They grow faster and healthier, and basic irrigation work where you have a functioning irrigation system and it just needs to kind of be converted to something more efficient. To measure the areas, if your areas are pretty simple, kind of rectangular spaces, measuring it by hand is always going to be the easiest thing. But if it's a kind of weird shape, and if there's not a lot of tree cover, you can actually use Google Maps online. If you pull up your property on Google Maps and then click, it's usually in one of the lower corners, the square that will turn it to the aerial photo view so you can see what's going on from the kind of just map view. You can right click and you can bring up a measuring tool where you can kind of connect the dots over an area. And in the bottom of the window, it will automatically tell you, once you finish connecting the dots, what the area is. It will also tell you the total length of the line you made. So make sure you're looking at area, but it will tell you that enclosed area. So that's a nice quick way to do it if you have a weird shape. You're also going to have to tell them which, quote, sustainable landscape approach you're going to use. That tends to get a lot of people kind of confused. It's something that I think the wording must have come out of some sort of committee. Basically, all that means is you need to do something in your project area that when it rains, some of that rain is going to get caught either in a container or filter into the ground, like in a dry stream bed or an infiltration basin. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So it's going to have a bunch of options: rain garden, rock garden, dry riverbed, swale, berms, rain barrel, or cistern. Some of them, like what the difference between a dry riverbed and a rock garden, don't worry too much about it. Just choose the one that's closest to what you think and you'll be fine. What you're actually getting judged on is whether or not the project meets that requirement. Don't worry too much about which word you select. And then it's going to ask you the total number of plants to be planted as part of the project. They expect at least 3 plants per 100 square feet to be planted. That's the requirements for the program. And that doesn't mean each individual 100 square foot block needs to be gridded out and have 3 plants in it. That's just an average. And that's a really easy average to hit. Most gardens, if they're a nice kind of fully grown garden, are going to be higher than that anyways. But you do want to make sure. So basically what that means is if you are planting 1,000 square feet and getting the refund, you need a minimum of 30 plants over the whole project area. And any hardscape areas that you put in, like you can put in a patio, but it all needs to be permeable. You can't get a rebate for putting in concrete, but you can put in something like a gravel patio where the water can soak in underneath. And then you're just going to have more plants somewhere else to make up for that area that had no plants. And then just a couple of last things. You're going to need to upload a copy of your recent water bill, a copy of a landscape plan. Don't let that landscape plan intimidate you. I've seen a lot of the things that they approve. It can be very basic. It can look like a 6-year-old drew it. It can just be a freehand drawing on white paper, graph paper if you want. Can be to scale on graph paper, doesn't need to be. Freehand drawing of the property, just showing what you intend to do, where your plants are going to be, maybe some ideas for what some of those plants are. They just want to know that you've thought about it. So don't get intimidated by the plan, showing where on the plan your water infiltration feature is going to be, that sort of stuff. You're going to need to also upload at least 5 current color photos of the project area. And the idea is that that's to show them that it's your yard, so no one can pull a fast one on them. So each of those should have in the background like a bit of the house, a bit of the garage, something like that. If you have a small yard, it's okay if they kind of overlap from different angles. No close-ups of plants or your turf, because that could be anywhere. And then after you get your approval, which will take 2 to 3 weeks usually, you have half a year, 180 days to complete the project. As soon as you complete the project, you want to upload your completed photos with the same login at SoCalWaterSmart.com, and then you could formally request your rebate, and then you'll get notified of it. And then after some processing time, after you get notified of your approval, you'll get your check. Important thing to remember, this was a state legal requirement. They just could not get around this. Rebates over $600 will be taxed as if they were income. So if you get a $1,000 rebate, you'll get tax documentation for $400 at the end of the year. So keep that in mind. If you do your full 5,000 square feet, get a $15,000 check, still a great deal, but you're going to be on the hook for some of that come tax season. So quick couple of examples. This was my front yard when I was applying for the rebate. Brown, just fine, but that turf is still there. That worked for a photo. This would not work for a photo. So as we move into the next section, checking the questions, had one question coming from Dennis. Do I think all native gardens have advantages over other gardens which mix California natives with other water conserving plant material? Good question, Dennis. I think it all goes back to your goals. If your goal is simply water conservation, then not necessarily, as long as within the water conserving plant material and those natives, everything is compatible. Some California natives really want very minimal water, where some like Mediterranean natives are going to be their best on like twice a month water. That's going to be too much for certain California natives. So as long as you do that research, just for water conservation, maybe not, especially like California natives and succulents mix really easily. So I think it comes down to what your other motivations are. For me, a lot of my motivation in the yards that I do and my personal yard is to provide maximum wildlife habitat benefit, mostly for local songbirds, lizards, pollinators, and butterflies. And in most areas, in most cases, the native plants are going to be best for that. So I have areas where I have my fruit trees and my vegetable gardens, but if it's not a fruit tree or vegetable, it's pretty much a California native, because that's one of my big goals. And then additionally, like some people like the idea of planting plants from the place where their land is. And so I don't do all local native plants, but I like the idea. There's been so much of California that's been flattened, so much habitat that's been lost. So I'll mix plants from various parts of California. But personally, for me, my goals, my philosophy at home, those are some of the reasons why I generally stick with California natives. A lot of people, though, really like to mix in succulents for some of that sculptural effect. Maybe in the summer, if some of the native plants don't look at their peak, that helps hold it together aesthetically. It's a great reason to mix things up. So moving on, we're going to talk some about the sustainable landscape requirement. And for those of you who aren't interested in the rebates, this is just our basic crash course in water harvesting, holding water in your landscape. For the rebate, a rain barrel is technically an option if you have rain gutters all around your house, but it's usually not your best solution. The reason why I'm not that big on rain barrels, and if you have rain barrels and you're into it, that's great. I'm not telling you to take it out. But the reason why I'm not that big on rain barrels is because a 50-gallon rain barrel, even a couple of them, once it starts raining, those fill up like that. I mean, so quickly. And then even in a water-wise garden of even a modest size, you're not going to have to water for a long time after the rain. And then the first time you do, you're going to be using way more usually than 50 or 100 gallons of water. You might not water often, you might water once a month, but you're going to give a good deep soak when you do. So for example, a 1,000 square foot roof surface in a 1-inch rainstorm will run off the roof more than 600 gallons of water. Very significant. So if you have a couple of rain barrels and there's a series of storms, they're going to overflow really quickly. And then the first time you need to put down an inch of water, which is a typical like how much water you would put down once a month for a native garden in the dry season. If you have a 1,000 square foot landscape, you need to put down 600 gallons of water to meet that equivalent. So you're not going to get too far with rain barrels. The additional thing with rain barrels is that If you don't maintain them and make sure that the inlet where the water goes in is perfectly screened, there's a little tear in the screen, then you have 50 to 100 gallons of mosquito habitat right outside your door. So not what most people want if you're not going to maintain it. So if you're passionate about it, if you have a bunch of potted plants on a porch that has an overhang, that's a good use for that water. But for most of us, putting the water into the ground is going to be the way where in a rain event, we can capture hundreds, if not thousands of gallons of water. It will immediately, in a modest rain event, provide a much deeper soak available to the plant roots in the local area where we hold that water, like in our dry stream bed. And then over time, it will help recharge the groundwater table, which if it's an area like where we are, is important over time because we use that groundwater. And so when we talk about holding on to rainwater in the landscape, the new approach to rainwater is to do something to slow that water down, calm it down, to let it spread out, and then to allow it to sink into the ground. The way a lot of our cities were built up into the last few years was essentially we engineer the water just to go away, especially in newer subdivisions and developments. A lot of times it'll go straight off the roof, down a downspout, right into a pipe and out into the street. And so a lot of what people do in those sort of situations is they'll actually rearrange that downspout so it doesn't go away and it will go into something like the dry stream bed. And wherever you're going to soak that water into the landscape, ideally, you'll find a space that's at least 10 feet from your building foundations. That's the best practice. They might need to run by your buildings, but you don't want it to soak in where you might cause a kind of consistently wet building foundation if you have the option. Now, sometimes you're fixing a drainage situation that's so bad that even if it's closer, it's going to be better than it was before. So it's all going to be a little bit site specific. And so you can see in these pictures, this is part of my front yard. We don't have roof gutters, and because of the way that the eaves on the house are shaped, there'd be a lot of surgery to the house to be able to put gutters in. And so the water drops from the roof into this kind of very narrow dry stream bed that takes the water right off the roof. And because the house is downslope from the front yard, we used to have a lot of flooding at the base of the house. This whole area would flood when it rained. And so we took that water through, we dug a trench, it's called a French drain, dug a trench, filled it with this 1.5 inch gravel, and the water kind of, the landscape slopes, and then the bottom of the trench slopes this way just gently. So some of the water infiltrates as it goes, but in a big storm event, a lot of that water flows to the side, flows around the house, and then gets into the backyard where there's much more space and we have a more kind of traditional dry stream bed with a little bridge over it made of broken concrete. And so to do this, it's all going to be based on the specifics of your yard. So it's all going to start with observation. And you don't need to be a genius and you don't need to be an engineer to be able to do it. You're going to look at your yard. You're going to observe, where does the water come from? It's ideal if you can be there in at least a couple of storm events to really, really look at it. If you've been there for a while, then you might already know this backwards and forwards, especially if you have issues to solve. But if you're new onto the property, if you've just purchased your house, I really encourage you, don't do your final design for this until you have gone through at least a storm event. If you apply for the rebate and then end up changing where you do your infiltration feature or your dry stream bed, that's not a problem at all, as long as it's there. So where does the water come from? How much water is it? Is it really gushing? Is it causing erosion? Or is it just kind of a calm trickle already that isn't causing problems and you're just going to really capture it and make sure it sinks in? How does it move through the property and where does it end up? Sometimes I'll work with people where there's already kind of a depression somewhere in the backyard and the water already ends up there. So they're just going to maybe dig it out some more, turn it into more of an aesthetic feature and make it more functional, where sometimes where it ends up is causing problems right at the base of the house and there's more work that needs to be done. Sometimes it's going to go off the property anyways, down a gentle slope. And so you're going to be building something that intercepts some of that, But if it's a big storm event and then the water is going to overload that feature that you dig, then you're just going to let it go merrily on its way, having slowed down some and having captured what you can. So for those of you who are interested in this, in January, I am going to, on a Saturday, be teaching a 3-hour class that goes into this a lot more. It's going to be called Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes, and we'll look at some kind of step-by-step projects. So I encourage you to join us for that. And then we'll also have the recording online afterwards. So I'm just going to provide one example from one of my favorite local landscapes that's sometimes on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour in the San Gabriel Valley. Designed and installed by a local company called Scrub J Studios. And so in the front yard, just right off the bat, they've replaced what would be a downspout from the gutter with this rain chain. Rain chains are kind of cool for a variety of ways. They look a lot nicer than the old metal downspout that used to be there, but they're also functional. So as the water comes down, it bounces off of each link in this rain chain. Rain chains are available at some nurseries. They're easy to buy online. As it bounces off of each link in this rain chain, not only does it look very interesting, but it's dissipating the velocity of that water. So we said that we're going to try to slow that water down as it comes in, so that by the time it reaches the garden level, it's not going to be as likely to be rushing off with eroding soil and moving the mulch. And so each little bounce dissipates a little of that velocity until it hits the bottom. And then at the bottom, it's landing first here in a pot to allow for easy cleaning of some of the grit that's coming off the roof and allow for, because it kind of just looks nice. It'll easily overflow if it gets too full. It was drilled out wider at the base, but after that, it goes into gravel first. So again, it's calming that down some. And then after that, it goes into the mulched general landscape. But I also want to show along the side where it starts with this normal downspout. It hits just this piece of concrete here, dissipating that velocity, slowing it down, and channeling it into, again, this French drain, which is essentially what you would do in an area where you don't have room for a wide or dry stream bed. So filling with gravel. And that gravel is usually about 1.5 inch to 2 inch size gravel. You want it to be large enough that there's, as the gravel comes together, there's decent sized air pockets in between each piece, which happens with larger gravel that has more capacity to hold and move water. And then working with just some larger rock to kind of make it look a little bit nicer, a little bit more interesting. And I really like how he used on the walls of this, these recycled terracotta roofing tiles, and then surrounded by some young native plants. And so when the water comes down, it goes through this system where it's narrow on the side of the house. The area slopes, and so some of it will infiltrate, but a lot of it will go that way. Just digging underneath the existing concrete walkway. Most of the time, if the concrete's in good shape, you can dig just a small passage underneath without having to do any reinforcement, and that water will be able to go through. When I do that, I like to get at the hardware store just a couple of wide pieces of PVC pipe, maybe like a 6 to 8 inch diameter, so that it goes through the pipe when it goes underneath instead of maybe washing away soil underneath. It helps protect the concrete. And so it goes around to the other side, around the side of the house, where it can widen into this infiltration area, that 10 feet away from the house. And then if there is a big storm event, before this was put in, sometimes a big storm events, these people's basement would flood. Now everything goes around passively, just with the gravity. And if there is a big storm event and it needs to overflow, it'll just go through the landscape and then eventually, if it needs to, out into the street. And so this kind of very naturalistic wildflower meadow may or may not be your style. Even if it's not, you can still have all of this function in the same way with a much more formal landscape. And so I always recommend for garden features like this, working with your local stone, whatever it is. In most cases, your local stone, which for us in most of Southern California is going to be this kind of mostly granite mixture of different colors of river rock, is one, normally looks more natural in the landscape, but two, that's what's going to be available in multiple sizes. So the quote ornamental gravels that you get bagged usually are only available in one size. And if you're doing something tiny like putting down a little layer over the potting soil in a potted cactus, some of those ornamental gravels might look nice. But once you try to fill like a landscape scale feature like this, it just doesn't look right. And so for features like this, you can start with just one size of gravel for most of it, and then mix in smaller. So this is sometimes called 1.5 inch gravel. Sometimes it's called drain rock, but you want to make sure if you order something called drain rock, it's going to be the kind of natural, just washed river rock. And then you can order and mix in some larger material, maybe some pea gravel or smaller material, and make it look quite nice. So it can end up being something quite beautiful looking. This is one that was done very artfully and can be pretty simple. So here is one causing what in many cases is a problem, which is the detached downhill garage, which if thatch on the turf has built up over time would tend to flood. And so they took this situation and the water is able to move this way out into the landscape. And then this garden still has a lot of planting and growing in to do. But again, they're capturing some of that water and then allowing what needs to overflow to go somewhere away from the structure where it's not going to cause a problem. Saw a few questions for coming in. How deep does the French drain trench need to be? I often do them about 1 foot deep. 18 inches is good as well, depending on your soil, if you can dig that. But minimum foot deep, 18 inches wide is usually sufficient. Depends how much you want to try to infiltrate. If you're going to be digging trenches in your yard, technically what you need to do legally and best practice is to call your local dig service, which most places have. In Southern California, it's called Dig Alert. You call 811 and for free within 72 hours, someone will come out from the service and mark any utilities that are in the area. That will include from the utility provider. So for example, they would mark where a water main line is, but not your water line on your property, where the gas main line is, not the gas line on your property. So depending on the year it's built and where you're digging, it might be very unlikely that they would mark anything, but it's always the best practice, especially in some newer developments where utilities are buried, like locally to us in Chino Hills, fiber optic internet lines are buried. And I definitely have heard stories of internet to the neighborhood going out because a landscaper replanted a trench and didn't call Dig Alert. So in a lot of other areas, the number is different. The service might be called something different, but it is available. From Yang, when it rains, the walkway will be watered all over. I don't quite understand the question. If you want to retype it in with more detail, if you're wondering if the gravel areas aren't necessarily intended to be walkways, sometimes people set them up where you can walk in them to do the garden maintenance. But in what we've seen, the rock or the gravel areas are mostly garden features, which do get filled with the rain when it's raining. Okay, Cindy, that's a very specific question about the bees and wasps. But if you stay on till the end of the presentation, I will have some time. I can give you some suggestions. Okay, so with that, if you do have other questions, keep them coming in. And if you're able to, please put the questions in the Q&A. It's easier for me to track it there than in the chat. So now we're going to shift with some of those basic principles set up to the part about choosing plants. So hopefully you've thought some about your goals. You've thought some about what you're going to do with water on the property. And now after you've thought about that, you start to have some more parameters. If your goals are to have some shade, you need to choose some trees. You've maybe thought about your space. If you're thinking about a patio over here, that you might need some shrubs around the patio and then some ground covers next to it. You start to get a little bit more of a vision of what you're going to need. And so what we're going to do is do a full example of a design process in just a little bit. But we're going to talk a little bit about choosing plants just by itself first. So when you get to choosing plants, you're going to want to do some research, and it should be fun. You're going to look at a lot of pretty pictures. This is a stage where a lot of people will fall in love with a bunch of different plants and want a ton of different things in their home landscape. For most people, I want to encourage you to keep it relatively simple. One of the classic mistakes that first-time gardeners make is that they put in too many different plants. They'll do one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that. And what happens is that aesthetically, that tends to look like really a jumble. It's hard to make it look like a coherent landscape. And then the maintenance becomes very tricky as well. And then if you fall in love with too many plants, really pay attention to how wide those plants are going to get. Don't cram in too many plants and crowd them. Not only will it not look good, but it can cause air circulation problems, encourage disease. They're going to be growing all over each other. You're going to have more maintenance as you need to cut them back. So respect the size that they're going to need over time. For most gardeners who, they're not wanting to be a horticulture enthusiast as their kind of identity in life. They're just wanting to have a nice landscape that takes less resources and maybe kind of gives back to the world some, maybe brings in some birds or something like that. Most front yards, between 12 and maximum 20 different kinds of plants. Maximum 12 to 15, I think, would suffice for most people. And certainly you can definitely design really nice landscapes with even fewer plants. You don't need 50 different plants. Most people do not want 100 different plants in their yard. And then the important thing for plants is to make sure that you do some research and you put the right plant in the right place. You're going to hear me say that a lot, probably. Right plant in the right place. And what that means is that you're going to set yourself and your plants up for success by doing some basic research. There are very few plants that want to grow absolutely anywhere. Even the easiest to grow plants are still generally going to have a preference for growing in the sun or the shade, for being a certain size, for a certain amount of water that it wants. Some of them are more flexible than others, but that information is going to be readily available for any plants you're considering. And those are the most important ones: sun or shade, full sun, part sun, or does it require shade? Or in Southern California, sometimes it'll burn to a crisp in the summer if it doesn't have the shade that it might need. Full sun doesn't necessarily need to be blasting full sun all day. For plants, that's usually defined as 6 or more hours of direct sunlight throughout the year. But oftentimes, a lot of our really nice water-wise plants are ones that thrive in full sun. And sometimes people will buy full sun plants and put them in too much shade if they have established trees. And very tough plants sometimes suffer and don't do well if they're in too much shade, if they need full sun. You're also going to want to take into account how your soil drains. Does it drain well or not? That's a new concept to most people. Essentially, most of our water-wise and native plants, not all, but most of them, want what's called well-drained soil, which is actually defined as once the soil is already quite wet, if you dig a hole, water will drain out of that hole at 2 inches per hour or more after you've filled that hole a few times. And that's basically all you need to do for a drainage test. And if the water drains out less than 1 inch per hour, you have poorly drained soil. Not the end of the world. What you'll need to do is just work off of plant lists for plants that are adapted to heavy clay soil. And I'll show you a resource in just a moment. And there are plenty of plants that are going to be just fine in that less than well-drained condition. And that might actually make your life choosing plants a little bit easier. There's fewer plants to choose from, but plenty to have a beautiful garden. And then size as well. How big is it going to get? Respect the size. That doesn't mean that you can't work with layers. For example, if you have a tree, it doesn't need to be just mulch under the tree. You can have trees, shrubs, ground covers, but don't have 2 6-foot shrubs planted 3 feet away from each other. It's going to be chaos and hard to manage. If your shrub says it's going to get 8 feet wide, don't plant it 2 feet from a walkway. It's not going to work out well. And If you're interested more in how to do that drainage test, I encourage you to download our native landscape design guide. And here's the URL right here, cbwcd.org/native design guide. That'll load into your web browser, and then you can save it. And there's, even if you're not specifically interested in California native landscapes, there's some cool design tips there, including a little box on how to do an infiltration test. We'll probably also end up talking about infiltration tests a little bit at our workshop this weekend. And then from there, you can start to look at resources to help with plant choices. Now, depending on where you are, might be different for those of you in the desert, Nevada. I'm sure there's local resources either through local universities, or through some of the larger water providers. For our area, and I'll also have some plants that you're probably interested in, our agency has created the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And so I'll show you this website really quickly. This is kind of a sister website to our main website. It's at inlandvalleygardenplanner.org, and it has detailed plant profiles for are basically 350 top plants for the average gardener. So nothing that's too crazy hard to grow. Things that you might need to go to a specialty nursery for these sorts of plants, but things that you can pretty reliably find, especially going into planting season like this fall, which is fall is our best planting season of the year here in Southern California. And so if you're kind of overwhelmed with this whole plant choosing thing, you can go directly to Garden Styles, where we have pre-composed palettes of compatible plants all around a theme. So for example, here you have the butterfly and songbird garden, and you can kind of see a little bit of the plants, and it's a coherent list. So there's a description of what this theme is kind of all about, and then a recommendation for this theme, our top tree, sometimes there's a few trees, shrubs, perennials, grasses. Some of them have more. This one's a pretty tight grouping to just make it very simple for people. A little bit of talk about the maintenance, the watering schedule for inland Southern California, what it's going to need throughout the year, and then some additional links you can follow to understand how do you make your home irrigation system do that, which is very important because every irrigation system puts out water at a different rate. So we give water in inches for that specific reason, that scales to any size, any irrigation system. And then with the information on this link, you can start to figure out how to turn that into the actual number of minutes your irrigation system would need to run. So a bunch of different themes that you can follow. And then within these themes, as well as all of the plants on the website, each plant on the website has images giving you an impression of what the plant does, description with size information, water needs. You can see the irrigation schedule for that particular plant, and then the properties. So the stuff that you need to understand to put the right plant in the right place, height, width, other stuff, flower color, when it flowers, if you're trying to have flowers throughout the year, which you can do in Southern California, soil. So is it adapted to that clay soil? What kind of sun it needs? And then any other information about it. And then once you have them in your landscape, either you or your gardener is going to need to know how to maintain them. So we have information about the maintenance for each one. Don't let the number of words on the maintenance scare you. Most of the maintenance is quite simple for the plants. Most of them don't need to be touched more than once or twice a year for some cleanup, but oftentimes it's really important if you need to cut it back once a year, what time of year is really important, because usually that coincides to when it does most of its growing. And so if it wants to be cut back in the spring and you cut it back in the fall, it's not going to have a good result. So we have all that information there for you. Sometimes it's just me ranting about all the crazy things I see people do over maintaining the plants when what they need to do is leave them alone a little bit more. So you have that detailed information for all 350 plants on the website. But the real core of the website is the plant finder, where you can search by multiple criteria. So of the 350 plants, say that you're looking for a shrub, 146 shrubs, but then you want to be California native, low water use, we don't have anything really high water use, but low water use there. It's going to be full sun. And you do have that slower draining clay soil. So now we're down to 31, and you also want it to be something that attracts butterflies. So now you're down to 10, and from there you can start to look at the individual profiles. And here within shrubs, you'll have larger things like toyon, that's going to be a 15 to 20 foot shrub, and our native buckwheat, that'll be about near thigh high and maybe about 5 feet wide. And then from here you can check out each of them. You can also create your own login. And with that, then you can save lists of plants. You can also access printable versions of these plant profiles. So it lets you do a couple of different things. And you can have multiple lists. So you can have kind of like garden idea 1, garden idea 2, idea for my grandma's house, all that sort of stuff. And then there's also other lists, like just our very favorite plants for local gardens, plants that are good for dry stream beds, where if you're going to have an area that floods, most of the plants don't want to be right down in that dry stream bed in the area that's going to flood. But we have a list for plants that are good around the rim. And then we also have lower down plants that will actually be fine to get that seasonal flooding right down in there. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner in a nutshell. For those of you who are really interested in California native plants, there's also a really cool website called Calscape that has a lot more native plants. It can be kind of overwhelming for some beginning gardeners, but has a lot of really great information as well on some rarer plants. And then for those of you in our local area and you're wondering where to get these plants, on that same webpage where you can download the slides of this presentation, cbwcd.org/presentations. You can download our local landscape suppliers list, where among other things, it has a list of nurseries that specialize in water-wise plants and the kinds of plants that each of those nurseries carry. Also, for those of you from farther out, calscape.org has some good information about what nurseries carry which native plants. So, a couple of questions, I guess just one more question that came in, or a few. So one, mostly sandy soils. How challenging is that for drought-resistant plantings? Sandy soils is kind of the ideal. Usually it's well draining, and even if it's very extremely fast draining, there's plenty of plants that are adapted to it. And then there's another one, how do we suggest managing weeds? We are going to be getting that in the turf removal section in terms of getting control of weeds right at the beginning. As much as you can do before you plant, that's what you're going to want to do. However, over time, there is just going to be some weeding that needs to be done. No landscape is zero maintenance. And so in my yard, I mostly do hand weeding. Mulching will help some, whether it's a wood chip mulch or a gravel mulch, not having too much bare open soil, and then making sure that you have enough planting density. Sometimes you'll see landscapes go in where it's just like a sea of wood chip mulch and a plant here and a plant there. Weeds are gonna, over time, love to grow in that situation. But if you plant a yard where it's mostly plant cover, and then you'll have pathways and open space where you're actually going to use it, then that will provide an environment where the soil surface is mostly shaded, and you're going to have less problems with weeds as things grow in. Now, if you are in a fire hazard area in the urban wildland interface, you're going to want to follow local guidelines for plant density there. And just in between, there's just going to need to be some weed management. That's just going to be how it works for those areas where you just can't have that higher plant density. So, moving on. If you are in our local service area, so if your water is provided by Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Fontana, or Upland, by coming to this class, you qualify for our Residential Landscape Design Assistance Program. And that is a program where our staff, and currently that is me, will actually work with you one-on-one to develop a landscape design for your yard. We'll do either a front yard or a backyard. If you complete one, we're happy to do the next one. It's a no-cost program. We do require a $100 refundable deposit. And if you install that landscape, fill out our survey materials, and send us some pictures of the completed landscape, we will give you a full deposit check back. You'll choose a design style, which are any of those top 8 of the garden styles, which are basically all of the themes that we've found that most people want. For some reason, if that doesn't work for you, we'll still work with you on it. And then you'll do things like send us measurements of your yard, photos of your site, and then we will have over Zoom an online screen sharing meeting, one-on-one, or me with your family, whoever is going to be involved. And we will actually start to create a custom design for your yard. This is an example of one of them. And then you get a plant key with what all these plants are, additional information that will help you on the process. And so if you are in our local area, you can get the full details of that at cbwcd.org/design assistance. There's a lot of information, a lot of stuff to read through. We really want to make sure people understand what they're going to be getting, and then come to this class if you know anyone else who's interested in the program, because we feel that this class really helps people understand what it is that they're going to be in for. And we're about to do that full kind of run through of a design example. But one note before we do that about planning for construction. Most important thing, make sure you consider it and think it through. I've definitely worked with people who get excited. They buy a bunch of plants, they don't have a plan, and 3 months later, they're still trying to keep their little 1-gallon plants happy, watering them with a hose. They're starting to not look very good because they weren't ready to actually do their construction. So are you going to build this thing that you're planning all at once, or in phases, or a bit at a time on the weekends when you find the time? That's just fine. That's how I always do my projects at home. Plan to plant in the best season of the year to set yourself up for success. In Southern California, mid to late fall is the best. Realistically, I always try to do my planting, if I can, a little bit before Thanksgiving through maybe the new year, with a little bit before Thanksgiving to the end of November, first weeks of December really being the best. When you do that, it might still be kind of warm in November, but the days are a lot shorter. There's enough light and enough heat that plants will, some of them will start growing right away. A lot of them might just root in some. They might not appear to do much, but they'll be kind of starting to root in over the winter. But then when it gets hot the next year in the spring, things will be ready to take off. If you plant in spring for a lot of our water-wise plants, by the time it gets really hot in summer, their roots just haven't been as established as they could be. Now, that being said, sometimes people plant in spring, and that's just fine. You never want to plant in the middle of summer, though. If you're planting just succulents and cacti, maybe you can get away with it, but it's certainly not ideal. And if you have turf, killing the turf can take longer than you think as well. We're going to be talking about that soon. So realistically, if you're down to just some weeds or dirt, get on it and you can plant this season. If you are starting with living kind of turf, it might be best to plan for a next fall installation. And you can think a lot about your design. Summer is a really good time for contemplating design. Summer is the best time for killing turf. You can prepare irrigation and then plant mid to late fall. Work with your budget and adjust your design and phasing as necessary. And if you're going to be working with a contractor or a professional landscaper to do the work, bring them in early, talk with them about price, get usually at least 3 quotes minimum. Within the landscape world, you can bring in 3 landscapers and the price range can be pretty extreme. Different landscapers will set their pricing and do the process of their quotes in very different ways. So I always suggest get 3 people out to the site, get 3 quotes, and the lowest one is not always the best. Always ask for references. I always encourage people to ask for at least 3 references of similar sized projects. So if you're doing an entire front yard, you want to make sure you're getting large project kind of references and not just like one planter bed here or there. making sure that the person kind of has that skills and experience. If someone is way cheaper than the other people, that might be the person with less experience who halfway through the job is going to come back to you asking for more money. So check those references of that low bid and make sure that things look good. Technically, Southern California or California contractor law, any projects with a value combined materials and labor of over $500 needs to be done by a licensed landscape contractor. If someone is licensed, ask for their license number and you can look it up online to make sure they're in good standing. So do your due diligence. There's definitely more involved with this than just manual labor that anyone with a truck can do, especially to install a water-wise garden well, which is not always within the skill set of a guy with a truck and a lawnmower, although there are plenty of great installers out there. So get people out, get different estimates, and check their references. So now we're going to go through an example of bringing this all together in a design. And what we're going to look at is an example of the front yard of where I am at now. My partner and I moved in about 2 years ago. And I always start just getting my ideas down for a design with just a sketch, not worrying about getting it all measured out to scale on graph paper. Normally, how I will do it is I'll just pull up the property on Google Maps, zoom in some, and just freehand draw it on a piece of printer paper. Doesn't need to be a work of art. And oftentimes, the first couple of times I'll start drawing it, things will be way off. The sizes won't even be right. Throw it out. Usually 3 or 4 times in, I'll have something that I think is respectable enough. At that point in time, save that sheet of paper, scan it, photocopy it, just have one that you never draw on again because you don't want to have to redraw the whole thing. You can have the base and work with sheets of tracing paper is really effective. If you're the kind of person that wants to get all your measurements, draw it out on graph paper from the beginning, you can go for it, but it's absolutely not necessary. And then either on that base piece of paper or nearby, I just list the goals. So I can always refer back to them and question as I go, am I getting distracted by just putting in a bunch of random plants, or am I really focusing on the goals for the project? And so here was the basic things that we needed to have here: the planting area, the driveway, the walkway. I always put in the windows and the door because for most front yards especially, we relate to our front yard a lot from inside the house, looking out. We don't often in Southern California spend a lot of time in our front yards, or if you are, it's still important how things look from inside the windows, but you want to frame the views not to just look good from the street, but to also be really nice from inside the house. I also put the ridges of the house because I'm going to also diagram out later what happens when the water falls in a rain event and it comes off the roof. And then anything on the bordering neighbor side. So the neighbor just has a gravel strip here and a driveway. Here, when our past residents replaced the original water main line, they dug it in really shallow. It's only about 6 inches deep. So that was important for us to map. We knew that that was something that we needed to be careful with, and put the water meter location as well. That box is something that someone from the water company needs to check and read. So we don't want to put a shrub that's going to grow over it. And so our goals are for a front yard to have it be beautiful. We want that habitat, especially for local birds, pollinators, and butterflies. We want it to be low water. This house is on a cul-de-sac, and how that specific cul-de-sac is set up is for most of the windows in the house, at least 3, if not 4 different houses kind of face right to it. And it's not a huge front yard. It's not tiny. It's about 1,200 square feet of planting area. So the house is, from where I'm sitting right now, looking into the front yard, if the neighbor has their living room curtains open and is watching TV, I see their TV. So we wanted a little more privacy without really just putting up like a fence and turning our back to the neighborhood. We want it to smell great. Walking to the car, coming from the driveway, having the door open on a warm day to work with some of those incredible smelling California native plants. And there's not a lot of street trees in our neighborhood, which is not ideal. We totally have the urban heat island effect thing going on. But because of that, because of where we're situated and because we're facing north, we do have great views of the San Gabriel Mountains out all of these windows. And so we want to plant things, but we want to strategically put our taller plants so that we'll maintain our mountain views out of these windows. So those are the basic goals. With the goals, we move into site analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying, noting down your observations. It's important to observe for as long as it's going to take you to be confident in things. It's not crazy to, if you're moving on to a new site, to at least get through all of the seasons once. If you have a new house, before you make a huge investment in the time, money, energy it's going to take to redo this. You especially want to get through a rainy season. Sometimes it's just not obvious what your issues with water are going to be. And once you put all your new plants in the ground, you can't really start fixing issues. The things you're going to be looking at are sunny and shady areas, thinking about how that changes throughout the year, your soil and drainage that we already talked about, views, whether that's the view out of something like the mountains, or it's a view into your house or into your property that you want to kind of have some more separation. Microclimates are something to note. Microclimates are basically any particularly hot or cold areas on your property. So example, a common one in our inland valley areas are really hot areas. So like the strip right along an asphalt or concrete driveway, anything that's up against a plaster or concrete wall that faces west and captures that afternoon sun, and then the plants are getting blasted both from the sun and from the heat, from the reflected heat from the wall. Those are hot microclimates. And occasionally I'll work with someone that has an area, for example, sometimes we'll work with people in Chino Hills that their property is right at the base of one of those hills, and they'll have a little frost pocket where the cold air in the winter comes down off the hills and gets stuck in their yard. So for the hot microclimates, those might be areas to work with colorful shrubs from the desert that are going to take all that heat and just turn it into more flowers in the summer. Or in the cold areas, making sure that the plants you put there are going to take that frost, where a lot of yards in the area might not have to worry about it. Are there noise or other neighbor issues where you want to plan for something like a water feature to mask for some of that noise? And then what are the existing plants? If you have a beautiful mature magnolia tree, well, that's a medium water use tree, but that's something that's taken a long time to grow, might be beautiful, might be worth saving. And so coming up with a plan for those existing plants, which might not fit into the water-wise retrofit, but that's an area where maybe you'll plan for a different drip irrigation zone to give it that higher level of water that it needs right around that tree. And then other areas can be drier, and maybe you'll mix in some native plants that have a more meadowy effect that can take that higher level of water that that magnolia tree would want, for an example. Or just seasonal weeds that you know are ones that kind of consistently come back. And when you're thinking about what to do to prepare, you might have to do some extra work for those weeds. So that site analysis goes onto a layer over your base plan. So it could be tracing paper. Here I'm doing it just digitally, drawing on a tablet. And so here, again, doesn't need to be rocket science. Here's the site analysis in terms of the major things that are going to be relevant to what we're doing. Mountain view, here's the area that feels too open. This faces north. So this zone in yellow right here, a lot of the year is quite shady. And then midsummer, full blasting sun. So we're gonna have to take that into account, have to make sure that we use plants that are adapted to that. And there's not a ton of different ones, but we have plenty to choose from to make it work. When it rains, you can see all these blue arrows. The water comes down, but we have a slight slope that goes this way. And so the water comes off the house. Some water would come from the lawn, and this whole area, which is the walk in between the door and the driveway, would flood when it rains. So there we know that we have a problem where we're going to turn this problem into something that harvests that water and turns it into an asset for the garden, helps recharge the groundwater table. And that's basically the analysis for what are the main things that are going to be relevant and important to this design. With that, I don't jump to plants right away. I start to just work on some rough sketches to figure out the feel of the site. What are the large kind of broad strokes, things I'm going to want to do to make sure that I meet my goals? And so, for example, we know that to get our privacy, we want a couple of small trees. And if we align our small trees here, our main mountain view is actually this way. Here it aligns with one of the other tall trees in the neighborhood. So we're not going to miss much here. And so those are the sorts of things that we are going to be looking at, good places for the trees. We wanted one that would be a multi-trunk deciduous tree, which would be more open and more closed different parts of the year. And one here, which is right out of our living room, where we really wanted something that was going to be an evergreen multi-trunk small tree to provide that privacy. We put in a plan for an informal hedge here, so not really like hedge trimmer tight, but a grouping of a couple of different native shrubs to provide some privacy, but without putting up like a wall. And then from there, we start to build some layers from the windows and the door, which are mostly how we look at this garden, mostly from inside outwards. And so we have an area for smaller plants here. And then we knew that we wanted a meadowy effect with a bird bath for that habitat for the birds, and strategically placing the bird bath in the plan so it can be seen from both of these windows, which are the two main rooms where our cats hang out. And this is the room that I work from. And then we knew that then creating that layers, we'd have room for some mid-sized shrubs here. And so creating that buildup from the primary view, which in this case is inside the house, from the small to a little bit taller to medium sized to tallest plants. In having those layers, it also creates a sense of more depth of the landscape than we necessarily really have. It makes a small landscape feel deeper. But we also wanted to make sure that we didn't totally turn the back to the neighbors in the neighborhood. So you can see these little C's that I put here, which are small pops of color on the corners, especially here, like in front of the hedge, where we were going to put some small perennial plants to have little pops of color that are easy to see from the street, anyone walking down the sidewalk, the mailman coming up the driveway, all that sort of stuff. And so haven't even thought about plants yet, but that's the basic plan to have the feel of the site, the basic sizing of the site and what's going on, meet all of our goals. From there, we can start to think about plants. Because once we have this, now we can turn to our resources like the Inland Valley Garden Planner and say, okay, I need 2 small trees. I'm going to need a couple of, in this case, native plants that are good for habitat and also are good for hedges. I can find my plants that can do everything from shade to full sun. They're going to go in that zone. And then here you can see, as we've started to refine it, we realized that we had room for more medium-sized shrubs than I originally thought. And even in these other zones, I'm not saying I'm going to have this many of this plant yet. I'm just kind of creating lists. Here's the different kinds of plants that I think would be good here. Realized we wanted a couple of larger shrubs in areas kind of next to the windows where it won't block the view, but it'll provide more interest up against the house if you're outside on the sidewalk looking towards the house. If you are the kind of person who is interested in then taking all of your measurements, drawing it out on graph paper, the best resource I know of right now is a free book that you can download online, put out by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. It's created by a company called the Green Gardens Group. A lot of different water agencies have worked with them to create kind of guides for landscape transformation. The one put out by the LADWP just happens to be very simple, straightforward, so I'm a fan of it. And we created just a quick redirect link to make it easy for you to get that off the G3 website. And so you can get it at cbwcd.org/G3book. And among other things, it has a nice, on page 8, conversation about starting with a site plan, taking measurements, drawing it out. The only thing that I will mention is in the main area where G3 does a lot of their work, it's kind of LA proper, and the yard sizes tend to be smaller. And so they recommend standard graph paper. Each little square is going to be 1/4 of an inch. And they recommend as a starting point using 1/4 of an inch equaling 1 foot as the scale. If you're more in a suburban area like our service area where we are, what we find is that it tends to be best to have it be 1/4 of an inch, a 1/4 of an inch square would be 2 feet in each direction. So basically, if you're using like a ruler, 1/8 of an inch would be 1 foot. And it's best to buy 11 by 17 graph paper. And you can easily order that online. Sometimes art supply stores will have it 11 by 17 graph paper as a 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot scale, or if it's 1/4 inch squares, 2 foot in each direction. Sometimes you can get it with the 8-inch squares. That's the general recommended starting point for a medium or large size suburban front yard or backyard. That seems to work best. And so in here, you have a conversation that starts with a site plan, talk a little bit about planning on doing that shaping, whether it's digging down or mounding soil up to think about where the rain is going to go. And then talking about drawing out the plants to the size that they're actually going to be. And that would allow you to get your exact plant counts and order your plants with confidence. Now, some people just are not going to do that. That process is intimidating to them. If you're just not going to do that, you can still do your landscape design and put in a perfectly nice garden. There's parts of my backyard where my partner and I were just building it over time as a sculpture. And we knew that we weren't just going to hit the nursery once and put that whole thing in. We're buying the plants over time. So that's fine. You can totally do that. It's going to take more trips to the nursery. Just remember, when you do that, always get out there with the measuring tape, measure things out. Maybe you'll get some little markers, like I'll oftentimes get from the landscape supply store, those little sprinkler flags, like when people are doing sprinkler repair, and then write on them with a Sharpie what plant it's going to be. For our front yard, we just wanted to do it all as one project, order the plants efficiently, so drew it all out to scale. When I kind of doing professional projects, I always have to draw it all out to scale. But if that intimidates you, don't worry about it. Do what's going to work for you. So in this case, here's the kind of final planting plan for my front yard, where I kind of have this and then have a key where each initial equals a certain plant. And then to kind of quickly see the process. So this was the yard when we moved in. Here it was in January when we were getting ready to get going. And, you know, here you can see I said aim to plant in the fall. Here we are planting in March, getting going because this was the absolute latest that I wanted to plant. It was really later than I wanted to plant, but my partner and I are both professional horticulturists that work a lot with native plants. And we weren't going to be the people who move into the neighborhood and immediately don't take care of their lawn while telling people what we do for a living. And we also weren't going to wait a whole other year. So we got past our winter season, understood the water issues, and then did it in the spring. And if you do it in the spring, early enough spring, chances are, if you're careful with how you water during establishment, most of your plants will live. And then the plants that don't live, you can replant again in the fall. So you can see here, and we knew for our turf removal technique that these grasses that were growing back, we identified the species. This was just a little annual one. It wasn't the main turf coming back. We eventually did have some of the main Bermuda grass coming back, and we just need to pull it out. And so you can see here, you can see the trench from our French drain. This is the plant layout. Again, we have some meadowy areas here with higher plant density, and then larger plants farther out with a lower plant density. And this is it, freshly planted. And again, you see it looks like there's nothing there. You can see the pile of mulch that was getting delivered. We were accumulating cardboard boxes to use a technique called sheet mulching to smother any lawn that would try to come back. And this is mulch for our rather large backyard as well. So you wouldn't need a huge pile of mulch like this necessarily for the front yard. And then working with, we're going to talk about it a little bit more in just a few moments, sheet mulching, recycled cardboard boxes that we scavenged as a temporary biodegradable weed barrier. So here it is, approximately 2 months. It's starting to grow a little bit, little flower color, but still a lot of mulch. But don't get discouraged. You can see starting to work, doing it a little bit at a time over the weekend as we have time. So we got the gravel in, and then starting to work with larger stones slowly as I was actually digging it up as I was doing other projects in the backyard, integrating it in. And then at about 5 months, that next August, had the door open one day when it was a hot day, and noticed you can't really see the design intent yet, but it is a garden. You see more plants than mulch. You can see things starting to grow in. So this is one of our 2 small trees, Western Redbud, starting to get nice blooms from the California fuchsia. starting to see signs of supporting native pollinators. This is a good thing. This is California native leafcutter bees harvesting these little semicircles out of our western redbud, and they use those chewed up leaf material to build their nests. We got our yard certified as a wildlife habitat, which is something that you can do through the National Wildlife Federation. They give you this nice sign, kind of lets the neighbors know what you're up to or people coming to the door. And it's just a self-certification process with a small donation. And as long as you provide food, water, cover, places for wildlife to raise young, which in this case are our shrubs, then you can get that certification. And it's actually starting to happen. So by August that year, noticing things like a hummingbird, where every morning I would sit on my couch and eat breakfast. And this hummingbird every morning would hang out on this one particular flower stalk, this old grass flower stem that we just left. And it would then chase around. They eat little gnats and bugs and things, and then come back and then chase around and chase off the other hummingbirds. And so starting to grow in the first year. You always lose a few plants, even in the healthiest growing in of gardens. Usually you won't have 100% of your plants take, so don't get discouraged. Just think, sometimes it just happens, or was it the right plant in the right place? And in fact, here, this is a mistake that I made. Red buckwheat does take full sun in a lot of areas, but close to my driveway, it was just too much afternoon heat. And so we're going to replace it with something else. After approximately 6 months, you can see things starting to grow in, starting to get nice color from the sunset manzanita with deer grass in the back. And we're not going to talk really here about like planting design, like how to mix the colors and textures of different plants. But if you're interested in more of the planting design stuff, check out our California Native Garden Design class or our DIY garden design classes, and we'll get more into that. So had another mulch delivery for the backyard at about 13 months, so just over a year. You can see it growing in, plenty of color. And so the trees still have a lot of growing in to do to really, and the hedge as well, to really have the full design intent be shown, but lots of beauty in less than 2 years. So this is 13 months. And then planning out, when we do the planning phase of always having something in flower. So this is spring. And then in the background, then the yarrow and the coyote mint then come into bloom later once the coral bells and some of the other spring flowering plants stop. So it's a really dynamic space. And in the California Native Garden Design class, we go through that same example, but even in more depth if you have more interest. But first, if you have a lawn or if you have a weedy area, you need to get that stuff out, because this is your best chance to really set yourself up for long-term success with the maintenance. If you don't do a thorough enough job getting your lawn out, what will happen is that in the spring, it's going to get going again once it gets warm and you're watering even your water-wise plants for what's generally like a once a week deep soak to get them established before you cut the water. The funny thing about most of the species of lawn that we have growing in Southern California is that when you want them to be beautiful, evenly green, they want to die and have lots of brown spots. But once you want it to give up and just fully die, it's going to keep growing back enough that it's going to be growing at the base of your plants if you don't do a good job. And once your other plants start to grow in, it can just be a lot of work to try to keep up with. So you always want to do the best you can to fully kill your lawn right there at the beginning, at the outset. And so one thing that you're going to need to do is, in general, identify the type of turf you have, and then if you have any other like really problematic weeds. And so we're going to go through the turf identification and the removal techniques pretty quickly. If you are actually going to be doing this yourself, we do have a full 3-hour workshop online called Killing Your Lawn the Right Way. Really important to set yourself up for success. And we'll go through the basic techniques. So you don't necessarily need to spend the whole 3 hours going through that whole workshop if you don't want to. If you already know from this presentation what technique you're going to use, I would just encourage you to at least find that part on the YouTube video, because in that longer format workshop, I just give many more practical tips and tricks for each of the techniques we're going to briefly mention tonight. This is mostly to get you going thinking about it and to orient you, and then use that other workshop to really figure out how to do it. If you're going to be doing it, you're going to be investing the time. You really want to know all the tips and tricks that we can provide you. So the two main types of turf you need to figure out, one of which you have. One of them is cool season turf. Most commonly, that's a tall fescue type of grass. That's if you put down sod in Southern California, that's going to be the most common one. Sometimes put down from seed as well. Marathon is probably the most common. There's a few other ones. I think one's called Bolero. It has a relatively wide leaf, relatively dark green, and it, if with enough water, will be green and growing all year long. Even if you started with this, which is the most commonly planted lawn when a new lawn is going in, most people still end up with some or a lot of Bermuda grass. That is, if you have patches in your lawn that even with plenty of water in the coldest parts of the winter, it turns brown. That's because Bermuda grass is an example of a warm season grass that is green and growing in warm temperatures. And in Southern California, that might be most of the year. But in midwinter, usually browns out. And if you have an all Bermuda grass lawn, it will do this in the lower right. But oftentimes it's all mixed in together. Even if you started with that tall fescue, if you have a lawn service, the lawnmowers and string trimmers are carrying around seed from every type of lawn and depositing them everywhere that those gardeners go. Or even just in most neighborhoods, there's going to be some Bermuda grass lawns, and the Bermuda grass lawns put out seed really easily, and that can migrate to your lawn. It's kind of stringier, narrower, and this stuff is a survivor. It really wants to keep coming back, and it's really going to require work. And the reality is that even after doing the turf removal perfectly, a little bit of it is going to come back. And at the beginning, you just want to keep pulling it out when it does. Just reality. I'd be lying to you if I was saying don't expect some amount of it to come back. So this is kind of identifiers for common Bermuda. The easiest thing is in the warm season, it will be very quick if it's not mown for a couple of weeks to put out these almost like starburst looking seed heads. And the reason why it's so tough is, one, it's deep rooted, often down to like a foot deep for the roots. And if you just kind of rip it out at the top, it can easily grow back from either its rhizomes, its stolons, which are stems that go along the ground and reroot, or it can come back from seed. So you never want to try to get rid of it with like a rototiller, because you'll just chop it into thousands of pieces, each of which can regrow. And then you might have, after you take out your turf, find what's coming back is, in Southern California, something very common, yellow nutsedge, also called nutgrass. And it's not technically a grass, but it's just referred to sometimes as nutgrass. It's more related to papyrus. If it goes to flower, if you have in your yard, you don't want to let it go to flower. You don't want to let it set seed, but the flower looks like a mini papyrus. And you oftentimes won't even notice it if it's in the lawn. You can see on this upper picture where there is the lawn, it's kind of the yellower, glossier leaf. And this thing is another one that's just a survivor, because as it grows, it develops a lot of these nuts. And if you pull it out, it will leave the nuts in the soil and just grow back. So we'll talk about some techniques that work, but again, no matter what technique you use, some will come back. It likes water, so over the years after establishment, if you're watering a lot less, you will have less of it, but you still want to try to get it under control. Just pull it out as soon as you can if it comes up. And then again, in that Killing Your Lawn the Right Way class, we go way more into the identification and provide additional pictures as well, so you can kind of match things up with what you're seeing, talk about additional weeds. So we're going to talk about the turf removal techniques. My go-to turf removal technique is something called sheet mulching. And all of these techniques can be combined with any other technique for kind of maximum effect. Sheet mulching is a process of creating a temporary biodegradable weed barrier, either using corrugated cardboard, recycled corrugated cardboard, that you scavenge or get from someone who has just an abundance of it, or sometimes paper sheeting, and we'll look at an example of that as well. and basically putting that down in between your layer, in between your soil and underneath your layer of whatever you're going to cover the soil with, whether it's wood chips or gravel or anything like that. And what it does is it just acts as a barrier in between the weeds being able to grow back out and access the sun. It is permeable to water, so the roots of your new plants can get access to the water that they need to get access to. And it just lasts, depending on how much moisture is around and the weather, 6 months to a year. And usually by the time it just biodegrades, like it will literally just be gone, no evidence of it left eventually. And it will have improved the soil a little bit, basically compost in place. And it's long enough that most of the weeds underneath will have been cut off from access to sunlight for long enough that they will just have kind of rotted down in place. And so that process, in this case, this was a small all Bermuda grass lawn. And so because it was small and because it was a number of college students, we got together and we roughly dug out as much of the Bermuda grass as we could. And there would still be plenty of roots that would grow back, but we were able to do that because it was a small front lawn and we're only doing half of it as well. If it was a huge backyard, we wouldn't have been able to put the labor in, and we probably would have just only sheet mulched. So here we have that. And then in this case, we were mostly using boxes of solar panels because the landlord had a company that installed solar panels. So those were great, large. Other places you can get boxes are, if you can get large boxes, always the easiest. So you can talk to any place that delivers appliances. I know some people who have worked with local body shops that are ordering in things like bumpers for cars all the time. And a lot of those small businesses, they actually have to pay to get their recycling picked up in dumpsters. So they're sometimes happy to put boxes aside for you. And then smaller boxes can be fine as well if that's what you have access to. So for example, one time I helped someone with the design and she worked at Starbucks. So medium, small size boxes, but she said, she was able to accumulate enough in a week to do her whole yard. So work with what you can get access to. And to start, you're going to lay down the boxes. You always want to water the soil underneath really well ahead of time so you can kind of lock in moisture. You don't want to do this in a very dry garden. Water really well ahead of time. Let it dry out for a few days so you're not walking in muddy water, but that water will still be down lower, or you're not walking in muddy soil. And then you're going to lay out your boxes and you're going to water really well to get that cardboard to slump down to the surface of the soil, and you'll get it to be more permeable overall to water if there's sprinklers. And then you'll be able to get your nice mulch layer on top of it. And so you can see here that we did wood chip mulch in the planter areas and pea gravel in the pathways, and we are good. If you are digging out the lawn, then you can sheet mulch and kind of plant right afterwards. And what you do is, if you have large cardboard boxes, you put down the cardboard boxes first, and then when you plant, you just cut holes. And if the cardboard is wet or moist at all, it's really easy to cut holes. You can just use like an old bread knife or even a steak knife, anything that's serrated. Or my favorite is also my favorite garden tool. There's a tool called a hori hori, which is a Japanese, it's halfway between a knife and a trowel. And one side you can get one that's serrated, super useful for weeding and also perfect for cutting through the cardboard. And I show that tool and talk about it some in that full class on the turf removal. If you're working with the smaller boxes, like we were in the front yard example that I showed, I'll generally tend to plant first and then put the boxes in around it right afterwards. So whatever's going to work best for you. If you are leaving the turf and using this as the primary method by which you're killing the turf, it's best to install the cardboard, do your mulch, and leave everything to sit for a couple of months so that things tend to rot down. Now, one note about the Bermuda grass. The Bermuda grass, because it goes dormant in the winter, all of these control techniques are best used on the Bermuda grass when that Bermuda grass is actively growing. And some of them you need to do it in the summer. The sheet mulching in general, you can have some success if you do the sheet mulching when it's dormant, because when it comes back, the sheet mulch will still be there. But realistically, you will still have more growing back if it hasn't spent a couple of months when it's trying to grow underneath this sheet mulch. So there's just no silver bullet for the Bermuda grass. Now, if you are either dealing with just a weedy area that is not turf, or you have dug out the turf roughly, but you want to have this biodegradable layer to prevent it from coming back, you can also sheet mulch with paper rolls that you can get at the paint section at the hardware store. Just builder's paper or painter's paper. You always want to use the plain brown stuff, never the red stuff. The red stuff has a waterproof barrier, which is great if you spill a bucket of paint in your living room, but you don't want to block the water in your landscape. And so that's the brown stuff. You can get rolls that they're a little bit less than 3 feet wide. I like to do a double layer. And then whether it's cardboard or this paper, you always need to overlap, because a number of weeds, and especially the Bermuda grass, can kind of weave its way through. So for general weeds, I say about a 6-inch overlap. Bermuda grass, I like to do about a 9-inch overlap. If you're doing a large area, the cost for using these can add up surprisingly quickly to a number of hundreds of dollars, even for just like a medium-sized front yard. But sometimes people have a project schedule, they can't get a hold of that much cardboard, and that's something that's appealing to them. It's not effective as cardboard because it doesn't last as long, but especially for just general weeds, if anything that's sharp or like woody-ish kind of stems, just kind of do a general clean out. But if you know that there's a lot of like weed seeds in the ground, or there's smaller ground hugging weeds, a couple layers of this covered with wood chip mulch does surprisingly well. And will last long enough that you can be pretty effective against general weeds to prepare your site. I never recommend the weed barrier kind of black stuff that's sold at the hardware store or the landscape supply store. It's always made out of some sort of plastic. Usually it's kind of a plastic weave. And the thing is that they are designed to be, and claim that they allow water and air to go through the plastic. And you might not have any problems for the first couple of years, but ultimately in practice, what we see happen is pretty much always this. So there's the theory of how those are supposed to work, and then there's what actually happens, which is over time, especially if there's any wood chip mulch on top of these, or if there's just normal plants, which over time are going to start dropping their leaves and creating their own mulch layer, which is in theory a good thing. If you have this plastic barrier, it cuts it off. So that means that the soil never gets the benefit of those dropped leaves. But in addition to that, as that material breaks down on top of the plastic, over time, that organic matter turns into very small particles, and that will clog up all those tiny openings in that black plastic weed barrier, intended to allow water and air to get through down to the roots. So it will reduce the access that your plants have to water and air. It cuts off that cycling of organic matter to the soil, and eventually weeds start growing on top of it. Not only that, but usually after a number of years, the stuff just starts to break up in the soil anyways, and then you're pulling these weird fragile chunks of plastic out of your soil for could be decades to come. It just doesn't work as well as promised in practice, unfortunately. And since the ideal thing, what you're trying to do is just set everything up to support your plants, this stuff just doesn't do it. That's why I like recommending the sheet mulching approaches, which are just that temporary weed barrier that then just breaks down. Method number 2 is something called solarization. This is something that it is too late in the season to effectively do this, because it relies on the high heat of summer. And essentially what you are doing is using clear black plastic put down tightly over the landscape to create so much heat in the first 4 or so inches of soil that you're steam sterilizing everything there, all the weed seeds, any living plant material, It even will kill the soil microorganisms, but that's been highly studied because this technique is used in organic agriculture sometimes as a way to sterilize the soil. And what they do find is that the beneficial bacteria and fungus tend to recolonize the soil a lot quicker than the pathogens. So it will set back your soil life if that's something you're concerned about, but it still tends to overall be a benefit to the soil life long-term in terms of the balance between pathogens and good guys. And so this, to be effective, needs to be laid out in full sun only. So the area here in this example where you can see being shaded by the tree, that's probably not that effectively going to work unless this is just like only the very end of the day right here. And it will kill all the roots in those top 4 or whatever inches of soil. So personally, I would not put this plastic this close to this shrub or that close to the base of a tree for broad open areas that are just lawn. Generally, 8 to 10 weeks of high summer heat is needed. So even though it's still hot right now, chances are if you started solarizing, what would happen is the turf would look pretty dead, but you would get a lot of regrowth in the spring. You really want to do that 8 to 10 weeks of having this laid out. It's important that it's laid out kind of tightly, way down on the edges, either with landscape staples or lumber or something like that. Because if the wind is blowing through here and is flapping around, you're not going to concentrate that heat. Critical to water really deeply ahead of time. You need that water content in the soil to reach the high temperatures to really have things die. You're going to use clear plastic, not black. Full sun is necessary. And it can be just the clear plastic sheeting from the paint section of the hardware store. 4 mil, you can get it in different thicknesses. 4 mil or 6 mil work, but 4 mil, that's a little bit thinner, is going to have the best heat gain. And the local hardware stores will stock certain sizes of it. But if you're doing a large area, check on their websites. You can sometimes special order in or have mailed to you wider sheets. And so you have less areas where you need to bring the pieces together and weigh it down and really get that good overlap. And so here you can see combining techniques. So if you have a tree, both because of the shade and because you don't want to be frying all the tree's roots, you might do that sheet mulching technique underneath the tree and then maybe do the solarization farther out. Because you will only reach those high heat temperatures in the top 4 to 6 inches of soil usually, if you are using it on Bermuda grass, it will help a lot, but chances are, like everything, no silver bullet, you will have some weed growth. I do know some professional landscapers who will really leave this out for like 3 months and find it overall pretty effective. My general recommendation would be to at least do like that temporary roll of paper layer, and then you're still going to have some Bermuda grass growing back, most likely. That's just the reality. Method number 3, just physically removing it. That is something that tends to work best if you are dealing with small yards and teenage children with lots of energy at home. It does work, but it is a lot of physical work. For removing turf, you can, if you have just that cool season fescue, rent something called a sod cutter, which is a tool. You can rent it from like Home Depot. Not all of them have it, but the ones that rent tools, chances are they do. Give them a call or check the website to make sure they do. That will cut just like the top 2 or so inches of soil out with the turf. Not going to work very well with Bermuda grass other than just physically removing that thatch layer because the roots go farther down, but could work plus sheet mulching. Or if you just really have that cool season fescue, could potentially work. But then you're going to need to dispose of all of this. If you are going to be renting a dumpster to be doing that, the cost can add up quickly. Plan on spending over $1,000 for just the dumpstering fees for removing like 1,000 feet of turf. So it can get pretty expensive. And again, in that full workshop, we get way more into this and even look at those cost calculations for an example. If you have a small area, just digging it out can work. Generally, what you're going to do is you're going to dig it out in chunks with a spade. So not a flat shovel, but a shovel that has a point. And you're going to want to kind of beat off as much soil as you can, because you want to leave that soil in place. You don't want to be putting the soil into the dumpster and throwing out the turf plus the roots. You always throw out a little bit of soil. And in that full class, we go a little bit more into individual techniques for using the shovel to take out the turf in little chunks at a time. Again, best combined with another approach. If you don't have a small yard, realistically, whatever is going to happen is whatever you do, some Bermuda grass is going to come back in most cases. And plan on first year, you or a gardener you hire, checking for weed regrowth once a week, pulling it out. It might only take 5 minutes to pull out what grows back. Some weeks maybe less, some weeks nothing at all, but checking on it, because if things start growing, you really want to get on it right away. If you go a month without doing anything, it's going to be way more total time spent than what you would have to do checking on it once a week and doing just what comes up. I would say for the average yard to have the best success, first year, check on it once a week. Again, some weeks might be very little, or some weeks might be nothing. Second year, every other week. And then just depending on your neighborhood and the site, you'll have to see from there. Some yards, there might be very like no turf regrowth after that, maybe just some occasional weeding. In my yard, just because of how aggressively the Bermuda grass grew back, and the fact that I'm surrounded by Bermuda grass lawns, and sometimes they're not mowed right away. So there's always some like seeds coming in. Every other week to once a month, depending on the time of year, it's just kind of, I need to do a patrol and sometimes spend a few minutes pulling things out. Fourth technique is herbicide. Cautions if you decide to use herbicide. I feel like we need to at least cover it some, because the reality is, if anybody goes to a hardware store or a landscape supply store and says, I have Bermuda grass, what do I do? They will be handing you either Roundup or a off-brand name with the same chemical. People are still debating the science. There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of different scientists hired by different interests. But I will say that by the World Health Organization, as well as multiple jury lawsuit trials, it has been considered a carcinogen, specifically glyphosate, one of the active ingredients, and its lymphoma is what it has been causing, according to these organizations and in these jury trials. You know that it's something to be concerned about when the company that manufactures it self-proposed an $11 billion settlement to the claims, which are currently around 30,000 in just this country, as a way to hedge their costs, because they expect to potentially have to be paying more in these settlements. It's significant. So if somebody is going to choose to use it, which I don't endorse, but just might be happening, be careful. Consider it something that is potentially quite harmful. Wear proper personal protective equipment. Don't spray when it's breezy or windy, because it will travel on the breeze. And if it hits your neighbor's roses, they will be very mad at you. Know that Bermuda grass may still come back, just like all of these others. And it's not going to be something that you only would apply once. Usually it takes at least 4 applications, 2 weeks apart. So it's already going to take a couple of months to really effectively use it, even in the best circumstances. So at that point in time, you might as well be usually considering these other techniques as well, which are much more friendly both to the environment and for your health. Next thing for us to look at is you're probably going to need to make some changes for your irrigation system as well. Most lawn sprinkler systems only pop up 2 to 4 inches. And so that might be fine for a lawn, but as soon as you plant in your beautiful water-wise garden that has low plants and shrubs and maybe some trees, what will generally happen is that the closest plant will get way too much water. Everything else around will get hardly any water at all. So you're going to need to make some changes. If you're doing the turf replacement rebate program, you, to qualify for the program, need to either totally abandon and cap off your sprinkler system, convert it to a drip irrigation system, or convert it to a high efficiency rotating nozzle spray system. We'll talk about what all those are. So you're going to need to do something. We're going to briefly present what I consider to be the 2 good irrigation options. However, very recently taught a full 3-hour class specifically about converting lawn style irrigation systems, if that system is functional, using, in many cases, the valve, installing a pressure reducer or a filter if you are going to be putting in a drip irrigation system, using all of the underground piping, so you don't need to do any new trenching for your irrigation system, and then how to cap off some of the sprinklers and then just use some adapters to then be able to use all of that to feed a new drip system. So you don't necessarily need to start all over trenching everything up. So that class is currently online on our YouTube site. And over the next couple of weeks, I'm in the process. We've shot a lot of video going step by step in terms of showing us installing, either converting to spray systems from a lawn irrigation system or installing drip systems. So those kind of real step-by-step, real-time, seeing me do the work videos are going to be available as supplements, really, to go hand in hand with that class. So if you're going to do it yourself, really encourage you to take a look at those. It'll really help you a lot. If you're going to be working with the contractor, just kind of seeing what we're presenting here might be enough for you to guide them. If you're going to be hiring a contractor to do this, don't let them just tell you they're going to be putting in drip irrigation and go from there. Realistically, even with well-intentioned and experienced contractors, what we see are the drip systems that they install might be great for the plants kind of their first year, but don't work well long-term. You're going to want to install the kinds of systems we're about to look at. And your 2 choices are either to retrofit your spray system so that your spray nozzles are going to be high efficiency nozzles, and they are going to be on solid risers, which will always be at least 2 feet out of the ground so that they can spray above the closest plants and get way into the landscape, depending on your planting design. Or you can install what's called inline drip in a grid. There's also lots of bad options. So all of those individual, what are called button emitters, which go on the little, sometimes called spaghetti tube, 1/4-inch tube, which then goes onto an adapter onto a bigger tube. Those, while they're cheap and fast to install, don't really support the plants well long-term because they concentrate all the water right at the base of the plant. It's the opposite of what a water-wise plant wants over time and is actually bad for their health. And almost all of the time, and I literally mean like almost all of the time, when we have projects where we go to people's houses who have those, they've always fallen apart somewhere. It's gone undetected. Certain areas are getting way too much water. Certain areas are getting way too less water. They just don't hold up over time. And so if you're going to be retrofitting a spray system to be more efficient, you're going to be installing high efficiency rotating sprinkler nozzles. They're made by different brands. A common one is the Hunter MP Rotator. It's the most common one on the market. And instead of just like a lot of mist like a normal sprinkler, they're individual concentrated streams of water. Some go farther, some go less far, and they rotate around. So it gets a lot more of the water to where it's intended. And then it's going to be on something like this, where instead of a sprinkler that pops up out of the ground, minimally, you're going to have a 2-foot, what's called a riser, with a shrub head adapter and the sprinkler on it, and then secured somehow, which I normally do with a metal piece of strapping and then a piece of rebar hit 1 foot into the ground. For spray systems, if you have a well-designed and well-installed lawn sprinkler system, it will have what's called head-to-head coverage, which means that the sprinklers are spaced so that each sprinkler, the reach of the spray, hits basically the center, or goes all the way to the closest sprinkler next to it in each direction. That overlap is how these are designed to have even watering. Sometimes we find systems that have like what you have at the bottom, and that's going to have really dry zones and really wet zones. It's not intended for, it's just not how they're intended to be made. So this would be your time to ensure that. You might need to move 1 or 2 sprinkler heads or add 1 or 2 sprinkler heads. And again, we go through that process in that full class. And so that's what I did for my front yard. Drip irrigation system is great in certain areas, but my personal preference in wider areas is to go with spray if the planting design will work, where these can still spray over that planting and get far enough into the middle of the landscape. And I find this to be lower maintenance to take care of and a little bit more resilient overall, if it's an area that's adapted to have this go in well. If you have very small areas or areas where right off the edge of the landscape, you have really tall plantings, you're probably going to want to go with drip. And for drip, the drip that I recommend is in-line emitter drip tube. So that's where you're not inserting each individual emitter or popping it onto the end of the line. Where you see these holes, those are actually the engineered emitters embedded in this line at a regular spacing, which you will choose that spacing depending on your soil type. Most often is every foot down the line. You buy coils of it, and then you buy the different fittings to hold together pieces of line or tees or 90-degree fittings. And each one of these puts out water at a regulated rate to where it's the same amount of water coming out of each emitter. And it goes in literally in a grid. So if you're doing a wide area and the whole area is root zone of the plant, this is what it is. It's literally like it's watering. It's just all happening underneath that mulch layer. It's not going through the air. So in a large area like this, it can be a lot of tubing to put in, but this is what the plants want. They don't want all their water concentrated in one area. They want the whole area to be kind of evenly soaked so the roots can gather water far and wide. It's the only thing that makes sense in a small area like this. There's just no real way to have pop-up sprinklers not overspray onto the sidewalk where the water will be wasted. So I'll always go to drip for an area like this. A wider area, if you have a lot of pathways or things like that coming through, it could be a very good alternative as well. And then you don't need to put the water underneath the pathways. Depending on how large your area is, you might just adapt right off of the sprinklers, or you might put in something called a header if it's a really large area. And again, in that full class, we go over how do you decide which style you do, how to actually design the system. And so you can see here, this is an example of the, looks like we might have lost a couple of slides. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. There's just one slide out of order. So this is an example of my front yard where my irrigation system started at. And from there, that class will walk you through how to adapt that to, in this case, going to a high efficiency spray system that moved away from, used all the underground pipe, but moved away from what we put in as a new pathway, moved some sprinklers around to have a much more efficient layout, and did that conversion to have things go overhead. Or if you wanted to take that same landscape and install that drip grid irrigation system, how do you use those adapters, figure out the sizing, and do all of that? So getting towards the end, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. A note on the order of things. If you're going to take this on, what do you want to do in what order? So you're going to start as soon as you can, thinking about goals, your site observations, planning for your budget, starting to think about design. Take plenty of time on the design, maybe multiple ideas and kind of whittling down to your best ideas from there. If you're going to work with a contractor, as soon as you have your design, talk to multiple contractors, get those multiple quotes, check references. Good contractors are sometimes booked out many months in advance. So even if you're not going to be doing this till spring, start talking to contractors now. If you are planning on doing this, like already, waiting until next fall because you're going to be working on your design now, I'd say still get in touch with the contractors. They might not want to actually book you or schedule you this far out. Some of them maybe will, but certainly you can get those multiple quotes, figure out who you're going to work with, get on their radar and start having that conversation to make sure that you far enough out get onto their schedule. If you are going to be doing the turf replacement rebate application, as soon as you have your design, turn that in. After you get your approval, you're going to want to kill your turf, prepare your site if you need to be, digging down to set up your dry creek bed, your dry river bed, your infiltration basin, any of that stuff. You can start doing all that soil moving, rock work, any of that as soon as your turf is dead. And your primary irrigation system work. If you're installing spray irrigation, install all your irrigation there or do all your conversion. If you're doing drip irrigation, oftentimes everything will be done, all the prep work, but those final drip lines, that actual tubing is often not laid until right after planting. And then you'll do your planting, best done in late fall to early winter if you can. Definitely have it finished up by March if it's at all possible. And then you're going to do your final irrigation system work if you need to, like for your drip systems. Then you're going to be doing your mulch, your cleanup, your final touches, and then you'll move into that first critical year of establishment care for your landscape. And again, if you're interested in that, join us this Saturday for the installation and establishment of Waterwise and California Native Plants class. And as you're doing that, you get to enjoy watching your garden grow in. One quick note, if you're doing sheet mulching, you're going to want to make sure that your drip lines end up underneath that cardboard layer, not on top of it, or underneath that paper layer. So you might shake things up a little bit in this order of things to make sure that works. You can put down your drip grid in advance, and then just be very careful as you're cutting into your cardboard to make sure you're not cutting your drip lines. If you hit one or two, they're very easy to fix. Just make sure that you turn everything on, look for any leaks, and then fix them as soon as you can. So, as we conclude in the last few minutes, we'll cover just a few other thoughts on design. Consider having your garden give back to the local ecology by providing some of the habitat needed by songbirds, pollinators, and lizards. And you can do that by planting a variety of native plants that bloom throughout the year. So use those resources, try to have something blooming all throughout the year, which you absolutely can do in Southern California. And then most gardeners have been trained traditionally that you always want a deadhead, which means as soon as your flowers expire, you cut them back to try to get the plants to bloom more. If you are trying to support local birds, you want to let some of those seeds ripen and dry out, because that's the bird food. That's what they come around for. You don't need to provide bird feeders. The local native seeds and berries are going to be the best thing for them. So on things like our native sages or sagebrushes or buckwheats, let some of those turn brown. Learn to appreciate the beauty in just the arrangement of the dried flowers as well. And you will have so many little birds that will come to eat them. And then eventually, when you do cut them back, leave them somewhere in the garden, just adding to the mulch layer. And then a whole other cast of birds will come and eat the seeds off the ground. And provide some source of water, like a bird bath, or even just a saucer like that would go underneath a ceramic pot. You can get them at most nurseries. The glazed ones tend to be a lot easier to keep clean. And if you have a bird bath, change out the water every day, keep it fresh. And it will be amazing in most areas of Southern California how many birds will show up for a few native plants and some water. Or even if you're not working with native plants, just some water. Clean, fresh, consistent water is so needed by the local bird populations. And so thinking about shelter, what we have here is a water-wise garden. You have artificial turf, you have a few sago palms, and then open soil and just a few other plants kind of here and there. So it doesn't take a lot of water, but it's going to be hot. The artificial turf, it's plastic laid out in the landscape. It's really hot in the afternoon. This isn't a yard that anyone is really going to linger in, whether they're animals or humans walking by. Doesn't provide any shelter. This yard, this is shelter. This is habitat in action. And so this is aesthetically kind of unruly. Some people might like it. It perfectly appeals to me. I would much rather see this than most front yards. But even if you want it to be a little more kind of managed looking, that will still work. But there's young trees, there's shrubs, there's ground covers, there's all sorts of different things in flower. And this was actually a picture. This is a landscape that was designed and installed by the family that lives there. This woman was involved in a class taught by my partner, who's a professional horticulturist. And she emailed this picture after the class with this beautiful story about how they put in this garden and with their son have watched it grow in. And every single day before school and after school, they spend a moment there and they see who's coming. They get butterflies, they get native pollinators, there's birds, and it's really changed their experience of their front yard and even just kind of their experience of their daily lives. It provides shelter. And on a last note, if we are providing habitat, human habitat as well. So remember shaded places to sit and linger and to enjoy your beautiful garden. Our gardens are going to seem easier to care for if they're comfortable places that we enjoy spending time in. And then we'll want to be out there doing our little bit of seasonal garden cleanup or our cutting back plants every once in a while. And then our kind of more in-depth cleanup, maybe just in the fall and in the spring. You're going to want to be out there in the morning or in the evening, seeing the birds in the garden, seeing the butterflies, and then maybe you'll have your pruners with you and do a little cleanup as well. Doesn't need to cost a whole lot of money. So this is a front yard garden that I just happened to be driving by one day where I live in Pomona on a pretty busy street. California native garden, pretty obviously designed by the homeowner. And I kind of started counting plants, and it's maybe, if they were all planted from 1 gallon plants, which most of them would have been, about $100 worth of 1 gallon plants and a packet of wildflower seeds. And it transformed this front yard that was probably used to be a lawn. On this busy street, there's a lot more shelter for the house, feels farther back. There's going to be a tree providing some shade in the afternoon. There's that structural diversity of that habitat. And with the sagebrush and Cleveland sage, a couple of native plants, it smells absolutely amazing. So it does so much more than the lawn ever did with a lot less maintenance and a much lower water bill. So the very last note is to remember, with all of this stuff, if you're inspired and excited, to follow your goals. And within those goals, it's often better to keep it simple. So don't put in 100 different plants unless you becoming a gardener is your identity, or being a gardener is your identity. If that is great. If that's the case, my partner and I have hundreds of different plants, but we spend most of our free time in our garden. So I really like to end on this as the last slide with a picture for us to look at, because you can see this person is someone who probably wasn't from Southern California. They probably have an emotional connection to plants from other areas because they have this big hydrangea and this Japanese maple. But with that, they chose just one corner of their yard. They put right plant, right place, put it in a shady corner where they can provide that higher water just to that corner, have their little permeable patio space. And then in the front yard, very simple, native manzanita as what will grow into be a large shrub, almost the size of a small tree, native deergrass, and then some other water-wise plants, but probably less than 10 different kinds of plants put in strong groupings, just really lovely looking and very easy to maintain, perfectly adapted to Southern California. And so with that, thank you very much for joining us for this introduction on landscape transformation. Here are all of the websites that we talked about, including the upcoming workshops, the YouTube site, the link for the landscape design program, and our service area to sign up for our newsletter. And with that, I am going to launch just a very brief 4-question ending poll. This gives us some information about what you thought about this workshop, which is really important to us. We also love additional comments. If you have comments about whether or not this was helpful, if there was any particular things that you found useful, or anything that wasn't clear, please put them into the chat. We read all of them and really take them into account. And with that, as you fill that out, I'm going to start going through all of the last of the questions. And if you have more questions, feel free to send them in. So going back, let's see who's still here. So from Lura Press, I hope I got your name right, who just started raising monarch butterflies, interested in a butterfly garden, looking for water-wise ideas. a couple of additional resources for you. On our YouTube channel, we have a workshop that's all about habitat gardening. I think it's called Gardening for Birds, Butterflies, and Pollinators. So you'll get some great ideas. Murrieta is very similar in climate to where we are. So all of the ideas from that class will apply to you. And also something that you really are going to want to take a look at, especially for butterflies and going beyond monarchs, because there's so many cool butterflies in Southern California, is there is a really great YouTube channel called Landscape Integrity Films and Education, which is all about gardening with California native plants and a lot of really great information about butterflies, including like what are the native plant combinations to have so that you have the plants that both the caterpillars of different species need to eat and also the plants that will support the nectar needs of the adults. So I'm going to type that into the chat right now. So it's Landscape Integrity Films and Education. The acronym is LIFE, but you'll need the whole thing to actually find the YouTube channel. So for anybody, check that out. For those of you in inland Southern California, they have a whole series of beautifully shot videos at a gorgeous residential California native garden in Riverside. So a lot of really good kind of climate appropriate ideas and some really cool, less common plants. From Cynthia. Just clearing off some of these questions from Cynthia. Area she wants to change is sparsely covered with ground cover. Would that qualify for rebates? So if it's sparsely covered with ground cover, it will not qualify for the turf replacement rebate. But if you want to put in like the irrigation controller and get that irrigation controller rebate, that's not, that would be just fine. It's not as large of a rebate, but the per square foot one is for removing turf specifically. So from Cindy, any plant picks for households where a member is allergic to bee and wasp stings. We have an EpiPen, but curious to know if these landscapes are compatible in these circumstances. Thank you. Couple of things. So realistically, all those colorful flowers attract bees. That's just kind of naturally what happens. So you might want to look at a couple of different approaches. You can work with succulents. Succulents have some seasonal flowers. So they will attract some bees, but some of them are not quite as proliferous, especially if you work with things like yuccas, which will flower once in their life cycle, and they will bring a ton of bees, but the flowers will be pretty high up when they do. But what I might consider is working with a kind of water-wise meadow garden. If you don't have grass allergies, the bunch grasses they're wind pollinated, so they don't attract bees. There's nothing for them. And some of the grasses will support certain butterfly larvae, and certain small birds will eat the grass seeds. And so you can check out on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, there's a meadow garden template. There's some flowering stuff with more kind of traditional looking flowers that will attract bees, but all of the grasses, and there's beautiful big bunch grasses, there's small bunch grasses, those don't attract bees. And then if you're looking for trees, like oak trees, if you're looking for a big tree, don't really attract a lot of bees, would be one example. But you can do some other research online. But yeah, grasses, working with grasses, little ones, small ornamental grasses, kind of meadowy effect might be a place to start. From Sharon, how long did it take for the cardboard that's smothered by the mulch to disintegrate? Depending on the level of moisture, 6 months to maybe a year and a half. Normally I find 9 months to a year, and then it just breaks down. But when you cover it up by your mulch layer, you kind of never really see it unless you're kind of digging in it. Usually after a month or so, it's pretty easy to dig through, but then it'll take longer. If I'm doing areas that I really want to do long-term weed control on, like I know are going to be a pathway, I'll double up the cardboard if I have enough, and I won't water the cardboard ahead of time before I put the mulch down, and that will help it last a little bit longer. So the area I want to landscape is a hill full of weeds. What's the best way to remove these? There are a lot of particulars, depends on the weed species, depends on a lot of things. If it's a large hill, you're talking about like large scale land management. Oftentimes it might start with a high powered string trimmer and then maybe sheet mulching like or hand pulling individual areas. If it's really large, then you kind of start to get into restoration techniques. And ultimately it's a lot of labor. And then you might be looking at hand pulling just around the bases of your plants, with then needing to be on, depending on the time of year, a normal kind of rotation so things don't go to seed in the future, with a more high powered kind of string trimmer, kind of more mechanical work. From Carmen, what's the best time to start sheet mulching to prevent wild growing weeds that always come in the winter months? Whenever you can is the good time to do it. So, anytime between now and when those weeds are coming up, if you don't have time to kind of accumulate your materials and they're always coming up, and there's just kind of that physical like biomass of the weeds that are preventing you from putting down the cardboard, you can always come through there if you have access to one or can borrow one with like a high powered string trimmer, or even if you need to pull if there's really large things, but whatever you need to do to kind of just cut things back. You can usually, as long as it's not woody, just like leave things right there to rot and put your cardboard on top of it. Ideally, does the irrigation system go in before planting, or can planting come first? For sprays, ideally, all your irrigation stuff is going to be done first. For the drip, make sure all your pipes and stuff are ready to go. I even have like the spray sprinklers capped, all the adapters in, but then that last running of the actual drip tube can go in right after the planting. Whatever I do, whenever I plant, I'm always hose watering that first day of planting to really water everything in and settle the soil. And so, but you do want to make sure that if you're doing that drip, like the next day, you don't want to wait too long. The first and second waterings are always going to be the most important ones. You don't want to get behind on your irrigation system, not have a plan for your hand watering, and then have the plant stress right after you plant them. It's the opposite of what you would want to be doing to set yourself up for success with those plants growing in nicely. Okay, how would you get rid of Bahia grass? Solarization, sheet mulching, kind of all the same things. If it's really large and you're dealing with like the physical clumps, you might have to go out at it with a high power string trimmer, or occasionally do some digging if you need to as well. Okay, so I'm checking the chat. I think I've gotten to all the, oh, let's see if Marisol is still here. Marisol, I caught your question in the chat. What about rodents? Does your landscape attract them too? If so, what do you do to keep it under control? I don't have problems with rodents. I've never had problems with rodents in any of these landscapes in that sort of style. It just kind of depends where you're at. If you have issues, certainly if you are really worried about rodents, spacing your plants out a little bit farther apart is something you can do, or also not working with really dense ground covers. You can work more with shrubs, and for your larger shrubs, you can kind of prune them up at the bottom so there's not a lot of foliage right at the ground, would be something you can do. And then for a lot of people, it's only if you have like a problem. For me, maybe there'd be a mouse that runs through my yard every once in a while. I've not seen it. I get hawks that come to my yard pretty often, so that would probably help with the mice if they did show up. But I have not found a problem with it in my experience. See if anything else has come in. I think that's it. So with that, thank you for joining us this evening. Hope you sign up for our newsletter or join us for future classes, or check out our resources on our YouTube channel. have a good evening and a good coming weekend, and have fun and good luck with your gardening projects this season. Have a good night, everybody.